Chapter 25. Mischief Undone. A dragon it was, a worm of the seagoing variety. It rose up 20 feet above the seething waters, the back of its head spread like the hood of a cobra and lined with foot-long spikes. Its very appearance rocked the Balbello so violently that it nearly capsized. "Azo and Cha!" Mischief said. "Look at that thing!" "Get the child!" Geneva yelled. Two-toed Tom immediately raced up the length of the rocking vessel to claim Tria from the bow. Even the sudden arrival of the great serpent had not disturbed her from her meditations on Finnegan's whereabouts, but she put up no protest when Tom took her from her vulnerable position and brought her into the little cabin. The dragon, meanwhile, was speaking. "These waters are mine," it said, its voice deep and smooth, its tone quite equitable. "I demand a toll from anyone who sails through them." Its head swooped low as it scanned those upon the deck of the Balbello. "Today I will be generous. In return for your trespass here, I will only take... Let me see... What will I take?" It sniffed its head, skimming the creaking boards of the boat. "I shall take a girl child," it said. "Where is she? Don't hide her away." The dragon's head drew closer to the cabin door. "Bring her out," the dragon demanded. "Come on, let me have her, and I will guarantee you safe passage." He turned to Carlotti. "What is your destination, sir?" the worm said, all politeness. Carlotti shook his head. "Don't deny me now," the dragon went on, its terrible teeth perilously close to poor Carlotti's head, as though in an instant it would behead him. "You'll get no answers from him," said Geneva, glancing around to locate her sword. "He has no tongue." "Ah," said the dragon, turning to Geneva. "Then you tell me, woman. Where are you headed? To the Nonce, is it?" "Maybe. I can work up a current with my tail that will get you there in half the time." "I'm sure you can," said Geneva, pulling her sword out from the heap of garments where it lay. "Just give me the girl child," the dragon said, breathing so hard on the cabin doors they shook. "Not a chance," said Geneva, poking the side of the dragon's throat with her sword, drawing its attention away from the cabin. The beast threw its cadaverous gaze back toward her. "Now don't incense me, woman," the worm said. "Just let me have my toll." "You heard me, worm," Geneva replied. "Not a chance." "Damn thee, woman," the dragon said. "Take this!" It made a foul, retching sound and suddenly regurgitated the contents of its 5 stomachs in a noisome torrent that struck Geneva with such force it threw her across the deck. Her sword went out of her hand and spun across the boards. Geneva pulled herself to her feet, her boots sliding in the slime of the dragon's stomach juices. Twice she slipped, but on the 3rd attempt she succeeded in standing upright. She had picked a new weapon, one of the bigger bones the worm had spewed up. Racing back across the deck, she beat the bone back and forth against the snout of the dragon, and when the bone shattered, she picked up another, continuing to strike at the thing until that bone, like its predecessor, was smashed to smithereens. "How long is this little game going to go on for?" the dragon said, putting on a show of weariness. "I'm getting irritated." Mischief and the brothers were standing watching all of this, not knowing whether to hide or fling themselves over the side. "I'm not going near that thing," John Serpent warned. "You of all people, Serpent," said John Pluckett, "should be happy in its company." The exchange had drawn Geneva's attention. "Mischief!" she yelled. "Distract it!" "Do what?" "You heard me. Distract it." "How?" "Use your imagination." So saying, Geneva went down on her knees in the stinking filth that had been expelled from the worm and searched for her missing sword. "The grappling hook," said John Moot. "Mischief, listen to me. Get the grappling hook." "Where is it?" "Behind us," said John Drowse. "I don't see it." "On the cabin wall, Mischief!" John Moot yelled. "Are you blind?" There was indeed a hook hanging in place against the wall of the cabin. Unfortunately, it was directly beneath the dragon, which had reared up to better assess the dispersal of its enemies. "Don't worry," Drowse said. "It's not interested in us. We're beneath its notice." "Famous last words," said John Serpent. But Drowse was right. For the moment, at least, the dragon was uninterested in the John brothers. It was watching Geneva on her hands and knees, smiling with satisfaction at the sight of her humiliation. Mischief ducked beneath the snaking neck of the beast and snatched the grappling hook out of its cradle. It was about 6 feet long, and it had an iron hook at its end, but it didn't feel like the most potent of weapons. "It's going to break," Mischief said. "You've no choice," John Drowse yelled to Mischief. "I know," Mischief said. Then he hollered up at the great worm. "Hey, you!" The dragon glanced down at the brothers for a moment with a supercilious look, then it casually knocked them aside with its snout as though they were a piece of bad meat that had somehow found its way onto its plate. With Mischief floored, it slid its huge spiked head past him to get to the cabin door. "Girl child," it said, "you can come out now." It pushed at the door, which flew open, its hinges wrenched from the frame. Giddily, Mischief got to his feet. He heard Tom yelling to the beast to stay out. The creature drew a breath and expelled it. As it did so, all the windows in the cabin blew outwards, and a wave of smoky heat erupted from the interior. Coughing and blinded by tears, Two-Toed Tom and Tria stumbled out of the cabin, driven from their refuge by the heat. Then the dragon opened its mouth, sliding its scaly chin over the ship's creaking boards to scoop up the child. Before it could do so, Kiss Curl Carlotti came at it with a short sword and stabbed the tender flesh around its nostril. Dark blood sprang from the wound and hissed as it hit the Bell Bellows boards. The dragon's lip curled with anger, and it opened its mouth horrendously wide, dislocating its bottom jaw so that its mouth gaped like a tunnel. "Watch out, Carlotti!" Mischief yelled, scrambling over the wet deck to draw the dragon's attack away from the child. He went straight for its eye, driving the grappling hook at the narrowed orb. The hook caught under the dragon's eyelid more by chance than design. "Pull!" John Serpent yelled. Mischief did exactly that. The delicate membrane of the dragon's eyelid tore, and a second spray of blood came from the beast. Some of it spattered on Mischief's bare arms. It stung ferociously. The dragon shook its head, forcing Mischief to let go of his weapon. It reared up, letting out a bellow of narcissistic fury. "My face!" it cried, its din making the vessel reverberate from end to end. "My perfect face! My beautiful face!" It shook its head, loosing the hook from its lid. More blood spouted from the wound, filling the dragon's eye. "I think you did it," John Moot said. "I wouldn't be too sure," said Mischief, backing away over the blood-slickened boards. Half blinded, the dragon lowered its head to the deck again, opening its tunnel mouth and sliding its lower jaw over the boards to scoop Mischief up. Weaponless now, all the brothers could do was retreat before the creature's vast maw, yelling for help as they did so. "Geneva! Somebody! Please God, it's going to eat us alive!" "I'm coming," Geneva called back to him. She was still digging through the vomitus, searching for her sword. Her endeavor wasn't helped by the violent rocking of the boat, which was escalating as the dragon's motion turned the waters around the Bell Bellow to a seething frenzy. The dragon's maw was a foot or two from the brothers now. Having nowhere else to run, Mischief fled into the smoky cabin. "Meat!" the dragon yelled, determined to devour its mutilators. "You are all meat!" The spikes on the dragon's hood prevented it from getting through the door, but the maddened beast wasn't going to let a little detail like that stop it. It shook its head back and forth with such violence that the door frame cracked and broke. Then it pushed its head in through the opening it had made and into the cabin. The brothers were trapped. "Kick it!" yelled Philip. "Punch it!" yelled Drowse. With no hope of escape to left or right of the monster, and only the prospect of its hot-breathed throat ahead, Mischief went into a flailing frenzy, punching its snout, its lips, even its gums. But it availed him nothing. The worm thrust its head into the cabin and closed its teeth around the brother's body. It did so with a curious gentility. No doubt it could have bitten Mischief in half if it had desired to do so, but it apparently wanted to torment him with a slow devouring, to which end it dragged the screaming brothers out through the smashed door. On deck, everybody was yelling now, with the exception of Tria. Threats, demands, prayers, all were being offered up to keep Mischief from being eaten alive. The dragon was unmoved. Slowly, almost majestically, it lifted its head, the brother's body hanging out of either side of its mouth, and began to sink back down into the frantic waters of the Isabella. In one last act of desperation, Tom ran to the edge of the boat, reached out, and seized hold of Mischief's hand. Somehow the worm managed to speak, even though it had a choice piece of meat between its teeth. "2 for the price of 1, it growled. "Geneva!" Tom yelled. "For a Zoe's sake, help us!" "I'm here!" Geneva yelled back to him. She had finally located her sword. Not waiting to wipe the slime off it, she raced over the pitching deck to strike the enemy afresh. Tom had caught hold of the rail of the Bella with one hand, but his grip on the slick rail was tenuous, and every time the dragon pulled to loosen Tom's hold, its teeth sank more deeply into John Mischief's body. He and his brothers were not bearing all this in silence. They were letting it be known that this was an agony. 8 voices, all howling or sobbing or shouting, demanding that something be done to free them before it was too late. Geneva yelled out to the dragon now as she came to the side of the boat. "Put them down, worm," she demanded, "or I take your life. Down, I said." The dragon looked at Geneva's sword from the corner of its blood-blackened eye. Then, seeing that if it held on to its quarry for another moment, Geneva would slash its throat, it did 3 things in quick succession. It let go of John Mischief, who lost his grip on Tom and fell into the water. It lifted one of its taloned 4 feet and brought it down on the side of the boat, crashing through the deck and all the boards beneath to a spot well below the waterline. And finally, it picked up Two-Toed Tom and threw him as far as it could from the Belbello. As the creature turned back, Geneva's sword slashed across the dragon's upper chest. The worm unleashed an agonized din, the pitch of its vibration such that all the nails in the deck shot up out of the boards, leaving only the pitch that the shipwrights had used to seal the vessel holding the boards together. Then it dived after Geneva with terrifying speed, its pursuit driving her back across the boat, her weight enough to crack the pitch and separate the boards. In that instant, the Belbello, which had endured much, and mightily, became a doomed vessel. "Hem it!" Geneva yelled. The captain had been at the wheel throughout the dragon's attack, attempting to keep his vessel from capsizing in the tumult the worm had created. "Get Tria off the boat!" "But my ship!" "There's no help for it, Captain. Save the child!" As she spoke, the dragon's jaws snapped closed 3 inches from Geneva's face. Its stinging, rancid blood, along with a wave of heat from its pierced lung, erupted from the wound she had made in its chest, spattering her arms and neck, but she refused to let the pain drive her back. She held her ground, even though the wounded dragon snapped again and again, almost taking off her face. Luckily, with only one eye, its spatial judgment was spoiled so that it repeatedly missed its target. But the sound when the teeth met was terrifyingly solid, like the din of an iron door slamming closed over and over. Geneva took a deep breath and lifted her sword. She knew she wouldn't have a second chance at the blow she was about to deliver. She would have to drive down behind the solid breastbone in order to pierce its heart. It would either find its way into the dragon's vitals and kill the damned thing, or she would miss and the worm would swallow her. Making a silent prayer to the 91 goddesses of her homeland, she raised her sword. The creature was preparing to snap at her again. She could hear the muscles of its jaw creaking like an immense spring as they opened. Trusting to the goddesses and her instinct to guide her, she ducked down beneath the dragon's jaw and put the tip of her sword against its scaly throat. She met resistance immediately, as though she was pressing against bone. Cursing, she tried another place. The dragon opened its mouth, expelling the stench of its stomachs. This was it. She had to strike. It was now or never. She pushed, and yes, the sword broke the armor of hard gray-green scales and pierced its flesh. She threw all her body weight against the sword. It was enough. The blade slid down behind the creature's breastbone. She felt the worm's serpentine body shudder as the blade ran down into the cavity of its breast and pierced its vast heart. Its mouth, already gaping, opened a little wider still, and from deep, deep within the vile convolutions of the thing there came a noise like the growling of 1,000 rabid dogs. "Die!" she said to it just loud enough that it would hear. Then she twisted her blade in its heart. The rabid din got louder, and the stench from its stomachs became foul beyond measure, the smell of death released from the entrails of the beast. Slowly the dragon's good eye slid to the left so as to fix on Geneva one last time. It curled back its upper lip, baring its formidable array of teeth. But this was all an empty show. Its din was dying away. There was no real fury left in its wounded body. The dragon trembled down to its stinking core. Then, putting both its front legs on the side of the sinking vessel, it pushed off. Geneva let her sword slip out of her hands rather than risk being pulled into the sea as the dragon made its departure. She stumbled back onto the disintegrating deck, which was now 6 inches deep in water, scarcely believing that she'd bested the beast. "Are you alive?" McBean yelled to her. "Just," she said. While Geneva had been fighting with the dragon, McBean had broken out the little red lifeboat and had launched it over the opposite side of the Bell Bellow. Now he was hurriedly depositing Tria, for whom the dragon had forfeited its life, in the boat. Kiss Curl Carlotti was meanwhile attempting to salvage as much as he could from the sinking vessel. The precious map which Tom and Geneva had been consulting went into the captain's hands for safekeeping. The rest, some food, some kegs of water, a few more weapons, were quickly stored at the bottom of the lifeboat. Geneva drew a deep breath, thanked the goddesses for her survival, and started across the sinking vessel to the lifeboat. She scanned the waters as she did so, hoping against hope that the Isabella would give up the pair that she had claimed. The dragon hadn't yet sunk beneath the waves, she saw. Though weakened by blood loss, indeed barely able to lift its head above the waters, it continued to stay in the vicinity of the Bell Bellow as though it hoped it might still claim its wounder. The Isabella was dark with its blood, and there was a yellowish steam rising off the waves as if the mixture of salt water and the dragon's fluids were causing some kind of alchemical reaction. "Do you see any sign of Tom or mischief?" the captain asked Geneva. "No," she said grimly. "Nothing." "Here," said a frail voice from the railing. Geneva looked over the side of the ship. There, barely keeping their heads above the churning waters, were John Mischief and his siblings. Some of the brothers looked to have slipped into unconsciousness. 2 had their eyes rolled back in their sockets as if they were dead. "Oh, Lord," said McBean. "Let's get them in the lifeboat." Together, Carlotti and Geneva hauled the limp body of Mischief and his brothers out of the water and into the lifeboat. Then McBean pushed the little vessel off from the sinking ship, then proceeded to row away from the Bell Bellow so that they wouldn't be caught in the vortex when the vessel went under. Tria went quietly to the bow of the little boat and took up her usual position. "Emergency supplies?" Geneva said, gently easing Mischief's torn shirt out of his pants. The puncture wounds the dragon's teeth had left in his stomach and sides were ragged and deep. Blood was still oozing from them. Carlotti went to the stern of the lifeboat and brought out the emergency first aid kit. He opened it up and started to select some bandages and gauze, while Geneva kept her hands pressed on the worst of the wounds to prevent any further blood loss. They were now a safe distance from the Bell Bellow, and McBean stopped rowing and put up the oars. "I can take care of Mischief now," the captain said to Geneva. "You look for Tom." He pointed to his telescope, which was lying on the floor of the lifeboat. "Go on," McBean said. Then, with a terrible sadness in his voice, "I may have lost the Belbello, but I'm still captain of this boat. Find Tom. Please, God, find him." Geneva let McBean take over care of Mischief, and she started to scan the waters in the general vicinity of the spot where Tom had been thrown by the worm. Some distance from the little lifeboat, the broken body of the Belbello moaned eerily as the waters of the Isabella rushed into her hold. The captain didn't look up from tending to Mischief. This was not a sight he wished to witness. The noise of the vessel's demise grew louder. Its timbers burst, its mast cracked and fell into the water, throwing up a great wall of water. Then, just before the sea finally closed over her, the Belbello stopped sinking for a long moment, and in the sudden eerie hush, her bell could be heard tolling. 6 times it rang, and then the tolling ceased, and the rushing of the water began one final time, louder than ever. There was one last terrible crack from out of the depths, and Captain McBean's noble little vessel went down to join the tens of thousands of ships the Sea of Isabella had claimed over the centuries. Not once through all of this did the captain raise his eyes from his patients. When the noise of the Belbello's sinking finally quieted, he said, "Any sign of Tom?" "Not so far," Geneva replied, still searching the water. "And the worm?" the captain said. "Gone," Geneva replied. "Slipped out of sight when we weren't looking." "How are the brothers?" "Some, I think, are doing better than others," the captain said grimly. "I've stopped the blood from flowing, but none of them are conscious." He dropped his voice as though Mischief and his brothers might hear some of what he was saying. "It doesn't look good," he said. At that moment, Tria piped up, her voice as pale as her skin. "The nonce," she said. Geneva looked up from the melancholy sight of Mischief and his brothers to see that the girl was pointing off to the port side. A quarter of a mile from them, the waters of the Isabella grew considerably calmer. The storm clouds thinned out, and shafts of sunlight breached them. They illuminated a golden shore, and beyond that shore, a rising landscape of tropical lushness. Geneva hadn't been back to the nonce since the tragic hour of Finnegan's wedding to the Princess Boa, and though she'd surmised, along with Tom, that this was indeed where Tria was leading them, her flesh tingled at the prospect of returning there. "If there's any hope for Mischief and his brothers," Geneva said, "it's on the nonce." "What happens if one of them dies and the rest are still alive?" McBean said. "We'll deal with that problem when we get to it," Geneva replied. Then more quietly, "Let's just hope we don't have to." Suddenly there was a rapping on the side of the boat, for all the world like somebody knocking on a door desiring entrance, and Geneva turned around to see a very welcome sight. Two-toed Tom was hauling himself up over the side of the lifeboat. She went to help him. He clambered into the boat and collapsed, gasping, on the boards. "I was afraid you'd sailed off and give me up for dead." "We would never have done that," said Geneva. "What about our digger?" Tom replied, looking over at Mischief. "He's very badly wounded. We're heading to the nonce, Tom. Let's hope we can get some help for him there." "It's amazing he's even alive," Tom said admiringly. "He was in the dragon's mouth." "That he was," said the captain. "If the brothers live, they're going to have quite a tale to tell."
This ends Disc 6. Abarat, Disc 7.
The current was on their side. It carried them swiftly toward the island of the nonce. The condition of the wounded Mischief and his brothers did not deteriorate significantly as they went, and as the bright shore beckoned and the smell of blossoms sweetened the air, Geneva's spirits began to rise just a little. They were within perhaps 600 yards of the beach when something nudged the little boat from below. Geneva went to the side of the vessel. She could see the reef below. The water was no more than 15 feet deep. It was a beautiful spectacle. Colored fish of every shape and size moving in shoals or happy solitude among the coral canyons. And then, as she watched, panic seemed to seize them all. As a single animal, they twitched and swam into hiding, gone in 2 heartbeats. Geneva murmured the beginning of a prayer. "Goddesses, hear me in my hour of desperation." That was as far as she got. At that moment, a midnight black stain spread through the water beneath the boat. Geneva took a cautious step back from the edge of the lifeboat. "Get the child, Captain," she said very quietly. "Problem?" he murmured. "Déjà vu," she said. "I thought for certain it was—" "Dead?" said the worm as it rose out of the darkened waters. It was a truly grotesque sight. Geneva's sword was still lodged in its throat, and the creature's blood ran copiously from the wound over the once pristine scales of its neck and upper body. Violent shudders passed through its body as though it was about to have a fit of titanic proportions. "Do you have a gun, Captain?" Geneva murmured. Back in the Belbello. "Something," she said. "Anything. Kiss curl?" Carlotti moved down the little boat to look for something that they could use to defend themselves. His motion attracted the gaze of the worm, and without hesitation the creature swooped down. Kiss curl didn't have a chance. The captain came up behind him, unhooked his jaw, and took Carlotti into its mouth whole. "No!" Geneva yelled, flinging herself toward Kiss curl to catch hold of him before he was swallowed. But the dragon threw back its head like a bird taking a fish, and Carlotti slid out of sight into one of its bellies as silent in death as he had been in life. "Bastard thing!" Geneva said, tears of fury running down her cheeks. The dragon made a terrible sound in its throat, a low, joyless laughter. "Who will be next?" it said, scanning the survivors. "McBean," Geneva whispered. "Yes. Does the lifeboat have a flare gun?" "I believe it does. Can you get it?" "Surely. Very slowly, Captain. Take your time." The captain did as Geneva had instructed. With great caution, he lifted the center seat of the lifeboat, where there was a compartment containing emergency rations and, yes, a flare gun. The worm, meanwhile, twitched and reeled. It was obviously getting closer to collapse with every passing moment, but that didn't make it any less dangerous, Geneva knew. She had once seen a dragon take the lives of 6 people when it had all their swords driven into its head. "Here," the captain said, oh so softly, and put the flare gun into Geneva's hand. It was a cumbersome thing, but Geneva knew she didn't need to have perfect aim. Her target was large. Had the worm seen what they were doing? It opened its mouth and loosed a ragged noise, but the sound was more of anguish than of rage. The death tremors in its serpentine body were increasing with every beat of its heart. Geneva brought the gun into view. The worm's good eye flickered. There was a moment's stillness. Then the worm said, "Damn you, woman!" And Geneva fired the flare. It left a smoky red trail, bright even in the light of the approaching day. Though her aim didn't need to be good, it was. The flare flew straight down the dragon's throat, and for a moment the creature became the very image of its mythological self, the fire-breathing beast of the Testaments of Padashak that Geneva had learned by heart at school. And yea, the great dragon Cascathica Rendithius came upon the land like a plague, and fire came from its throat and blackened the living earth. She had scared herself many times as a child conjuring that image in her mind's eye, but seeing it now, made flesh, made smoke, it was not so terrible. It was just a worm, after all, petty and sly and cruel. Then the gunpowder exploded, and 2 columns of blinding white fire blew out the monster's eyes. The dragon screamed, a shriek that rose out of the inferno of its bellies and out of its throat and its pierced heart. It lasted a little time, then it died away. The dragon's body swayed, its eyes reduced to blackened holes, and without further sound the beast collapsed upon itself as though its spine had turned to jelly. It didn't fall to the left or right. It sank upon itself down into the blood-stained waters, descending so gracefully that it was gone from sight with scarcely a bubble. "Thank you, and good night," the captain remarked bitterly. "Worms," Geneva said, matching his bitterness. "I hate them with all my heart, and now they've taken Kiss Curl from us. I swear I will not be content until every dragon is wiped off these islands, and out of the waters, too, every last one." She looked sideways at Tom and the captain. "Agreed?" "Agreed," they both said. They all stood in silence then, meditating for a time on their lost comrade. And while they did so, the tide carried them gently to the beach, so that by the time their silent prayers were over and they raised their heads, the hull of the lifeboat was gently nudging the soft white sand of the Nonce. "We're here," said Tria. "Finnegan is somewhere on this island?" Geneva said. "Yes," the child replied. Tom shook his head in disbelief. "Back where it all started," he said. "Who would have thought?" They said no more, but worked in thoughtful silence for the next little while, carrying the body of John Mischief and his brothers from the boat and up the sand to the cool shadows of the blossom-filled trees that lined the shore. Chapter 26. The House of Lies. Candy walked across rolling hills, the route before her illuminated only by stars. As she went, she kept her eye on the strange domed house that was built on top of the hill. She was more tired and hungry with every step she took, and was desperately hoping she'd find a simple welcome there at the house. A place where she could finally lay her head down and sleep. Her limbs felt like lead, and her eyelids kept fluttering closed so that it felt that she was actually sleepwalking. She contemplated lying down right where she stood, making a nest for herself in the grass and napping until the worst of her exhaustion passed. But she rapidly argued herself out of that plan. She had no idea of what kind of animals lived on Ninnyhammer. For all she knew, it could be an island of venomous toads, vampiric weasels, and rabid snakes. Given the variety of strange fauna she'd encountered during her travels, anything was possible. So on she went, though her pace was slowing step by exhausted step. When she was about a mile from the house, she came upon a pillar topped with a little platform on which a well-fed fire was blazing. There were perhaps a dozen other such pillars, all topped with fires which apparently marked the perimeter of the homeowner's property. They certainly marked something, because once she had walked past the pillar, there was a subtle change in atmosphere. Though the pillar fires weren't particularly large, they cast a light with a strength out of all proportion to their size, multiplying Candy's shadow and making the solid ground appear to cavort beneath her feet. She also sensed the presence of living creatures in her imminent vicinity, though for some reason she couldn't catch sight of them. Perhaps they were too quick for her weary eyes, or hidden in the long grass, or simply, given that this was the Aberrat, invisible. But sometimes she felt them brushing her shins or nudging the back of her legs. After a while, their teasing presence began to annoy her. "Who are you?" she demanded finally. "Show yourselves, will you? There's nothing I hate more than games of hide-and-seek." Her demand had an immediate effect. Two animals, twice as large as domestic cats, but definitely of the feline family, emerged from behind a scattering of rocks close by. They had fur the color of brick and flame, with black stripes and vast, luminous eyes. "You look hungry," she said to them, "but it's no good looking at me. I don't have anything to give you." By way of reply, the scrawniest of the two cats let out a spine-tingling yowl, and within 30 seconds, half a dozen of its brethren had emerged from hiding. They all studied Candy with the same wide-eyed intensity as had the first couple. Candy was just a little unnerved. Were they now sizing her up for devouring? If not, then why had they been following so closely on her heels as though they were sniffing her raw flesh? She halted a second time, turned back to them, and said, "Will you just stop staring at me? Don't you know it's rude?" If they understood, they didn't respond to the instruction. They just kept following her, staring, as she strode along the narrow track that zigzagged up the slope toward the domed house. In fact, the closer she got to the house, the more agitated the cat's behavior became. Rather than being content to follow on her heels, they ran ahead, weaving back and forth in front of her as though they intended to trip her up. As they wove, they all let out the same caterwauling sound. It sounded like a chorus of damned souls, and it made Candy's stomach churn to hear it. At last she could bear it no longer. She nimbly leaped over the backs of the animals in her path and made a desperate dash for the house. The cat beasts came after her, their cacophony mounting in volume and disharmony the closer she got to the threshold. She could feel their hot breath on the backs of her legs as she ran, and she feared that at any moment the fastest of them would leap and dig its claws into her legs, immobilizing her. She managed to stay ahead of them, but the chase took its toll. By the time she reached the house, she was gasping for breath, her lungs and throat burning. She banged on the door and shouted as best her fiery throat would allow, "Is there anybody home?" There was no reply. She banged again, yelling with fresh gusto. By now the cats had caught up with her, but for some reason, instead of attacking her, they simply walked to and fro 2 or 3 yards from the threshold, yowling. "Will somebody please help me?" Candy said, hammering on the door yet again. This time she heard the sound of somebody moving behind the door. "Hurry!" she implored. After a few seconds, the door was opened by an acidic-looking man in a bright yellow suit. He was short, but his height was increased by the fact that he wore not one unshapely hat on his head, but several, all perched on top of one another. He also carried a hat in either hand, which he promptly added to the unruly pile. He then picked up a long staff that was propped just inside the front door, and with a curt, "Stand aside, girl," he charged past Candy and went after the cats with his staff. "Get out of my sight, you repugnant specks of rabidity!" he hollered. "You, girl, get inside!" The animals scattered until they were out of the range of his staff, but once that was accomplished, they began their toing and froing afresh, accompanied by that same anxious yowling. "Thank you," Candy said to her rescuer. "I was certain they were planning to attack me." "Oh, they were," the man replied, unsmiling. "I've no doubt of that. They were sent by the devil himself to torment me, those damned tarry cats." "Tarry cats, you call them?" "Yes, tarry cats. They have their own city on the other side of the island. It's called High Slatter. Why the hell they just can't stay there is beyond me. Did any of them get their claws in you?" "No, they didn't touch me. I was just frightened because they were chasing me, and then there was that noise they were making." "Vile, isn't it?" the man said grimly, waving Candy aside so that he could bolt the door top, middle, and bottom. "Believe me when I tell you there's reason to be afraid of those creatures. Every single one of them has taken an innocent life." "No!" "It's God's honest truth. Children have been smothered by fur balls. Babies have been bled dry by tarry cat fleas the size of my thumb. You're lucky you had the energy to outrun them. If you'd slipped and fallen, they would have been on you in a heartbeat. I saw you from my big window," he pointed up the stairs to what was presumably the dome of the house, "and I sent down a little incantation for you to speed your heels. I hope it helped." "Well, it must have worked, because here I am." "Here you are indeed, and I'm happy to see you." He set the stick down and turned to clasp Candy's hand. "I'm Caspar Wolfswinkle, philosopher, thaumaturgist, and connoisseur of fine rums. And you are—" "Candy Quackenbush." "Quackenbush. Quack and Bush. That's not an aberration name." No, it's not. I'm a visitor, I suppose you'd say." Caspar's deeply lined and gnomic face was a perfect portrait of fascination. "Indeed," he remarked casually. "A visitor? From—" his finger noodled about in the air. "The other place, perhaps." "The hereafter?" "Yes." "Well, well," Wolfswinkel said. "That's quite a journey you've taken, all the way from there to—" "Here," Candy prompted. "Yes, quite so. There to here. That's a ways." He smiled, though the expression sat uncomfortably on a face made for scowls and gloom. "You know, you really don't know how wonderful it is to have you in the house with me. Are you all alone?" "Well, more or less," Casper said, leading Candy into his living room. It made Samuel Klepp's press room look tidy by contrast. Books, pamphlets, and papers lay on every surface but one, the comfortable green leather chair into which Wolfswinkel now lowered himself, leaving Candy to stand. "Most of my family and friends are deceased," he went on. "Victims of the war waged upon us by those wretched kiddies." He sighed. "It was paradise here on Ninnyhammer till the tarry cats built that shantytown they call a city. I mean, I'm an older man, semi-retired. This was going to be the perfect hour for me to spend my twilight years. I planned to sit and sip my rum and ruminate on my life. Things done, things left undone. You know the way it is. I regret nothing, of course." "Oh," said Candy. "Well, I suppose that's good." She was a little lost for words on the subject of regret, so she moved on to a subject she did know something about. "It must be lonely," she said. "Yes," Casper said. "It gets lonely, to be sure. But what's worse than the loneliness are the memories." "Of what?" "Of how Ninnyhammer used to be before the tarry cats came. They turned this perfect island into a nightmare. They really did. Every now and again I get a supply of fuel for the fires." "The fires on the poles?" "Yes. They at least allow me to see the enemy. But I live in fear of the time when I run out of fuel and—" "The fires will go out." "Exactly. When that happens, well, I fear that'll be the end of me, and Casper Wolfswinkel will be a memory, too." "Surely there must be some way to catch the cats," Candy said. "Back home in Chicken Town—" "I'm sorry. Chicken Town? What exactly is a chicken town?" "It's the town where I live, or where I used to live." "What a perfectly ridiculous name for a place," Wolfswinkel commented. His tone brought out a little defensiveness in Candy. "It's no weirder than Ninnyhammer," she remarked. Wolfswinkel's eyes grew narrow and sly. "Well, of course this island isn't my real home," he said. "No? So why do you stay here?" "It's a very long story. Maybe I'll tell you later." "Why don't you sit down? You look tired." Candy glanced around the room for a place where she might take up his invitation. Wolfswinkel, seeing that all the chairs were occupied, muttered something under his breath and threw a simple gesture toward one of the smaller chairs. The pile of books perched upon it flew off the seat like a small flock of startled birds. "Now sit," he said. "May I take off my shoes?" "Be my guest. Allow me to get you something to eat. Make yourself at home." "My feet are killing me." "I knew somebody who had feet like that. They'd walk all over him. Archie Cashanian was his name. He used to wake up with footprints all over his chest, all over his face. It was the death of him, finally." Candy wasn't sure whether Casper was making a joke or not, so rather than insult him by laughing, she kept a straight face, though the idea of somebody being stomped to death by his own feet seemed utterly nonsensical. Once again, Candy changed the subject. "Back in the hereafter," she said, "we have people who catch stray animals and find new homes for them, or if they can't do that, then they have them put down." "Homes?" Wolfswinkel said, his tone incredulous. "Who would give a home to any one of those monsters? The infernal regions is the only home the Tarries deserve. Anyway, they can't be caught. They're too quick. They have to be tricked. Poison, that's the way. You see that plate of fish on the table by the door? It contains enough scathrasic acid to kill a whole pack of them. If only I could just get them to eat it. But they're suspicious of me." He paused, then he snapped his fingers. "Wait a minute," he said. Maybe you'd have more luck. Yes, I believe you would. Me? Said Candy. Yes, you. If they saw you putting out the food, you whom they don't really know, they'd be fooled into taking it. He looked smugly satisfied with his little plan. You just need to be very casual. He started to get up from his armchair. Wait, Candy said. I don't want to disappoint you, Mr. Wolfswinkle, especially as you've been so kind and all, but I'm not going to poison cats for you. If they were just cats, I'd understand your moral dilemma, Miss Quackenbush, but they're not. They're hellspawn. Trust me on this. Hellspawn. After all the harm they've done, not just to me, but to poor innocent people right across Ninnyhammer, scathrasic acid is kinder than they deserve, believe me. If there were any justice in heaven, they'd be struck down by lightning, every last one of them. Before Candy could reply to this outburst from her host, there was a sound from an adjacent room. "What was that?" she said. "Oh, it was just the wind," Wolfswinkle replied hurriedly. "Take no notice." "It didn't sound like the wind," Candy said, getting up out of her chair. "It sounded like a voice, like somebody crying." "Oh, crying? Well, yes, of course there's crying. I didn't want to depress you when you first arrived, but there are several mourners here in the house with me." "Mourners?" "One of my friends, a dear, dear friend, was killed by the Terrycats just yesterday, and we're having a wake on his behalf. You know, gathering to toast his memory and tell tales of what a fine fellow he was." "Really?" Candy said. Something about this explanation didn't quite ring true. "If there's a wake going on," she said, "then why are you wearing a bright yellow suit?" Wolfswinkle glanced down at his jaundiced ensemble, then feigned a look of surprise. "This is yellow?" he said. "Are you sure?" "Yes." "Oh, dear," he said pitifully. "Poor Casper. The blindness is getting worse." "You're saying you didn't realize that was a yellow suit?" said Candy, more and more certain that her suspicions were correct, and that this strange little man was for some reason deceiving her. "Yes," Casper said, putting his hand to his brow as though the drama was too much for him. But Candy wasn't convinced by his hammy theatrics. Her real interest now was to discover who had made the grieving sound she'd heard. She got up from her chair and went to the adjoining door through which the sound of sobbing had come. "Where are all these mourners, then?" she said as she went. Casper moved to stop her, but he wasn't quick enough. Candy stepped through the door into the next room. Just as she'd suspected, there was neither a casket here nor a corpse, nor so much as a single mourner. There was simply a dark, cluttered room, one of its walls dominated by a huge portrait of Casper sitting on an animal that looked like a cross between a giant armadillo and a camel. "There's no wake going on in this house," Candy snapped. "You were lying to me. I can't bear liars." Casper had followed her through the door. "So what if I was?" he replied nonchalantly. "It's my house. I can lie in my house if I want to. I can run around in the nude yelling hallelujahs if I so desire." "Didn't anybody ever tell you it was rude to lie?" "Maybe I can't help it," Casper said. "Maybe I've got an incurable disease that makes me lie. Poor Casper." "Oh," Candy said. "And do you have such a disease?" "Maybe I do. Maybe I don't." "Oh, stop it," Candy snapped, her temper stretched to breaking point. "Can't you simply tell me the truth?" "Well, yes, I suppose I could. But where would the fun be in that?" "You know what?" Candy said. "This is a ridiculous conversation, and you are a ridiculous little man." She turned on her heel and started to walk back toward the door she'd just walked through. "I wouldn't go out there if I were you. The Terrycats are still out there." "So what?" said Candy. "I'd prefer to take my chances with them than stay in here another—" Before she could finish, Casper stepped into the doorway, blocking her path. "What are you doing?" Candy said. "Get out of my way!" He didn't reply to this. He simply raised his arm, put his stubby-fingered hand over Candy's face, and shoved. Candy stumbled backward, her foot catching on a rucked-up rug. Down she went on her tailbone. It hurt, and she yelped. "I think you should stop being so judgmental, little missy," Wolfswinkel said, every little trace of kindliness abruptly gone from his face. He stood over her and looked her dead in the eye. "Believe me, I've done worse than lying in my life, a whole lot worse." "I believe you have," Candy said softly. She started to scramble to her feet. Wolfswinkel neatly kicked the legs from under her, and down she went for a second time. She was beginning to get a little scared of Wolfswinkel now. He might look like a clown with his stupid hats and his yellow suit, but then she'd always been a little afraid of clowns. "I want to leave now," she told him. "Do you indeed? Well, I'm afraid you're not going to. You're going to stay here with me." "You can't keep me here. I'm not—" "A child? You are to me. To me, you are an infant, a baby with no one to protect you. I'd lay a bet that nobody even knows you're here." Candy didn't reply, but her silence was all the confirmation Wolfswinkel required. "I didn't lie about one thing," Casper said. "What was that?" "I did whisper an incantation when I saw you. I prayed you'd make the mistake of ignoring the Terrycats who were trying to warn you about coming up here. Lo and behold, my supplications were answered. Into my hands you came like a stupid little fish." "One minute I'm a baby, the next minute I'm a fish," Candy snapped. "Make up your mind." She was feeling more afraid of Wolfswinkel by the moment, but she wasn't going to show it. "My error," Casper said. "You're not a baby, and you're not a fish. You're a hostage." "A what?" "You heard me, a hostage. I'll bet there are people out there who would pay a few thousand zem to have you in their hands." "Well, you can forget that," Candy said. "I don't have any friends in the Aberrat." "Now who's lying?" Wolfswinkel said, bending down to poke Candy. "Of course you've got friends. A pretty girl like you. You've probably got half a dozen boys pining away for you." Candy laughed out loud at the preposterousness of this. "Then you have family." "Not here, I don't," Candy said, thinking, while she spoke, of how quickly she could squirm out from between Wolfswinkel's legs and get to the door. "My parents are in Chicken Town." "Yes." Said Wolfswinkel. "Well, give me time. I'll find somebody here who wants you, somebody who'll pay a price. Malingo, where are you? Malingo! Present yourself before me right now, or I'll have your hide for boot leather." "I'm here," said a voice from above, and there, hanging upside down from a roof beam, was a creature that resembled a Halloween mask come to life. His skin was a mottled orange, the pupils in his dark-rimmed eyes dark slits. There were 4 knobbly horns on his head, and 2 large fans of leathery skin spread from either side of his head, where ordinary folks would have had ears. He was wearing a dirty T-shirt and an even dirtier pair of pants. He would have made a fearful sight if he hadn't worn such a pitiful expression on his face. Seeing him, Candy thought back to the weeping she'd heard when she'd first come into the house. This Malingo was surely the source of that unhappiness. "Come down here and catch hold of this wretched child for me," Wolfswinkel told him. "Now!" I'm coming. Malingo began to clamber down out of the rafters, but before he could reach ground level, Candy was away. She gave Casper a 2-handed shove in the belly, and then she raced back to the door between the rooms, darting through to the front room. Malingo was on the ground now. She could hear the slap of his bare feet as he raced over the tiled floor in pursuit of her. He was fast. She was barely halfway across the room when he caught hold of her. "Don't struggle," he said softly. "It'll be worse for the both of us if you fight him, believe me." Hearing the delicacy in Malingo's voice, Candy looked up and met his gaze. There was a sweetness in his eyes she hadn't expected to find there, the Halloween horror of his face concealing something far gentler. "Bring her back here," Wolfswinkel yelled, "and be quick about it." Malingo duly pulled Candy away from the front door and into the second room, where Casper was standing in front of a long mirror, rearranging the ridiculous tower of hats on his head. "I suggest you take Malingo's advice," Wolfswinkel said. "You really don't want to be on my bad side." Candy ignored him, struggling to free herself from Malingo's grip. But it was a lost cause. The creature was considerably stronger than she was, and to add to his physical strength, he gave off a dizzying smell, a bittersweet mixture of cloves and cinnamon and rotted limes. "Now listen, my dear," Wolfswinkel said. "You have to calm down. You're only going to exhaust yourself struggling like that. I'm not going to do any harm to you as long as you behave." He turned away from the mirror and walked across to the other side of the room, where a large square of tile on the floor had been painted an eye-pricking blue. At each corner of the square was a short, fat candle. "Candles, illume," Casper said, and with a little sound like a snatched breath, each of the candles ignited itself. "Brighter," he instructed them, and the flames grew longer, the illumination they threw up making every other lamp in the room inconsequential. "Now," said Casper, turning his attention back to Candy, "let's see what secrets you're keeping from me, shall we? Malingo, you know what to do." Malingo pushed Candy toward the blue square. "Don't worry," he whispered. "It doesn't hurt." "I heard that," Wolfswinkel said. "I don't know why you're trying to curry favor with this girl. She can't be of any use to you." "I'm just—" "Shut up," Casper snapped. "Put her in the light. Go on!" Malingo gave Candy a second little shove, and she stumbled forward into the square. As she did so, she felt her body pass through an invisible barrier. Within the square, she felt a peculiar pressure on her, as though the air inside the design was heavier than the air outside, and it was pressing against her body from every side. It was not by any means a pleasurable sensation. The pressure made it harder for her to draw breath, and her head ached furiously. Not only that, but being in the painted box sealed her off from the outside world. Now, though she could see Wolfswinkel giving orders to Malingo, she couldn't hear his voice. Clearly, there was now some kind of invisible wall around her. She tested the thesis by extending her hand. It was like pushing her fingers into cold fat. The thickened air congealed against her skin, and the sensation was so disgusting that Candy withdrew her hand before she even reached the limits of her persistence. Wolfswinkel, meanwhile, was waving his staff around as though he were writing letters in the air. The candles flickered, the cell convulsed around Candy. And then, much to her horror, she felt something pulling at her. Not at her hand or arm, but at some place in the center of her head. It didn't make her headache any worse, but she still felt somehow invaded by the sensation. It was as though Wolfswinkel was reaching inside her to pull something out. She saw strange smears of images appearing in the air at the end of Wolfswinkel's staff, and as they settled and focused, she realized that these images were recognizable to her. 10, 20, 30 pictures appeared, all plucked out of her memories. There was 34 Followill Street, where she had stood so often dreaming of the far away. There was her bedroom and her mother's face and the schoolyard and Widow White's house with its front lawn covered in colored pinwheels. Apparently none of these images was of the slightest interest to Wolfswinkel because he erased them with an irritated wave of his staff. He gathered his strength for a second summoning, and a new wave of images emerged from Candy's head, these more recent. First, there was the lighthouse and the ramshackle jetty of Hark's Harbor. Then there was mischief and shape and the turbulent waters of the Sea of Isabella. Then the sea skippers and the Yebba Dim Day. In the midst of all these familiar sights, however, was one Candy didn't recognize. It was a shape made of blue-green light that looked like a short length of braided ribbon which had been put in the deep freeze. There were tiny crystals glinting on it, and from one end spilled a trail of brightness that broke into tiny pinpoints of intense luminescence before they melted on the air. At the sight of it, Wolfswinkel paused, the color rising in his already ruddied cheeks. There was a look of shock on his face, of disbelief. "Will you look at that?" he mouthed. An ugly, avaricious smile had begun to creep onto his face. He left his staff to stand by itself, and he spat onto his palms, rubbing them together before wiping them on his trouser legs. With his hand thus prepared, he reached forward to take hold of the strange object that he'd conjured from out of Candy's mind. Though it wasn't solid, how could it be when it was made of pure thought? It nevertheless seemed to gain a measure of solidity as his hands closed around it. Candy felt a terrible wrenching pain in her skull as Wolfswinkel's fingers took possession of the object. There were flashes of white at the corners of her eyes which rapidly spread so that in a matter of moments they washed out her sight completely. Her legs grew suddenly weak beneath her. She toppled forward against the invisible wall of her square blue cell and then collapsed to the tiled floor. The last thing she remembered was the sound of Malingo's voice breaking through from the other side. He didn't speak her name. He simply let out a cry of distress. It echoed in Candy's throbbing head for a moment. Then it faded away, and she was lost to blissful unconsciousness. Chapter 27. Words with the Crisscross Man. Candy woke with the worst headache she'd ever experienced in her life, but at least she was no longer in the cell in which Caspar Wolfswinkel had imprisoned her. She was lying sprawled on a decadently overstuffed velvet chaise lounge, tossed there along with a load of old books. She sat up, her hand going up to her throbbing brow. She felt mildly feverish, and her eyes burned behind her lids when she blinked. Wolfswinkel was talking in the next room, sounding half-crazy with excitement. Yes, I know what I have, believe me. This is the pyramid key right here in my hand. Somebody had put it in her thoughts, but I've got it now." Candy got to her feet, fighting her giddiness, and went to the door between the rooms. As she approached it, however, something dropped into view in front of her. It was Malingo. He was hanging upside down from the rafters with one long, orange and partially bent finger pressed to his lips. Candy pointed through the door, indicating that she wanted to see Wolfswinkel, but he waved her away. Candy did as instructed. Bizarre though Malingo was, there was something about his gaze that not only endeared him to her, but also made her instinctively trust him. He climbed over the ceiling and, still inverted, clambered down the wall using minuscule cracks in the plaster as toe and finger holds. Then he flipped over and dropped lightly to the ground, 3 or 4 yards from Candy, his expression and his posture tentative, as though he was nervous in case all he earned for his troubles was a blow. "It's all right," Candy whispered. "I'm not going to hit you. You don't have to be frightened of me." Malingo sidled up to her. "You have to get out of here," he whispered. "My master's a very cruel man." "What are you two talking about?" Wolfswinkel yelled from the other room. "Show yourself, child. Now!" Candy knew it would be wiser to obey this petty despot rather than argue with him, so she went to the door and stepped into view. Wolfswinkel was sitting in his leather armchair with the receiver of an antiquated telephone in his hand. "I'm talking to somebody who has some considerable interest in you," he said. "Oh, really?" she replied with a little shrug. "It seems you're quite the celebrity, Candy Quackenbush. At least that's what I'm hearing." He returned his attention to the person at the other end of the line. "Yes, I've got her here right now. She's standing right in front of me as plain as day. Oh, she's about 5'3", 5'4". "So what am I to do with her, Otto? What's she worth on the open market?" Clearly the man he was talking to became agitated at this remark, because Wolfswinkel's next words were, "Calm down, Otto. That was a joke. I know Carrion wants her. But be reasonable. If he wants both the key and the girl, then I'm going to be expecting something substantial by way of recompense. That's only right and proper, isn't it?" "Ninnyhammer? No, I don't want Ninny Hammer. When all this is over, I never want to see this wretched little rock ever again. No! I want to be Lord of Babylonium, or Camexo City, anywhere but here. I'm sick of living in a place where everybody's half asleep. Again, the person at the other end of the line had something to say in response. Wolfswinkel listened, drumming his stubby fingers, like the fingers of a chicken slaughterer, fat with blood, on the threadbare arm of his chair. "Have you quite finished, Houlihan?" he said finally. "You seem to forget that I'm the one with the cards at this table. I've got something Carrion wants badly." No, not the girl. The key! I've got the key! I don't know how she got hold of it, but I'd stake my hats on the fact that it's the real thing. I know what power feels like, and this is it. He raised his right hand, which held the aforementioned key, and casually studied the object. He wore a smug smile as he listened to the reply from the fellow he was speaking to. Finally, he said, "Candy, get over here, will you? I'm speaking to a friend of mine called Otto Houlihan. He's a deal-maker, and he wants to speak with you." Wolfswinkel beckoned to her, his gesture impatient. "Hurry up, girl, and be polite. He just wants to know you're the real thing." Candy kept her distance. "Come on," Wolfswinkel muttered, his face reddening with fury. "Go," Malingo murmured behind her. "He loses his temper in a heartbeat." Very reluctantly, Candy went over to Wolfswinkel. "Here she is, Otto," Wolfswinkel said. He handed Candy the receiver. "Like I said, you be nice. Otto Houlihan's a very old friend of mine. We were at school together." Candy took the receiver from Wolfswinkel and put it to her ear. "Hello," she said. "Am I speaking to Candy Quackenbush?" The voice at the other end was silky smooth. She imagined she was talking to someone closely related to a snake, which, given the variety of people she had met so far, was not beyond the bounds of possibility. "Yes, I'm Candy Quackenbush." "Well, you're a very lucky young lady." "Am I?" Candy said. She didn't feel very lucky at the moment. "Why's that?" "Well, carrying that key around could have been the death of you." "Really?" she said. She didn't believe a word of it. "Agree with him," Wolfswinkel mouthed. "I didn't realize I even had a key," Candy said. She remembered how passionately mischief had impressed on her the need to deny that she had it. "You tell me the truth now," Houlihan was saying. "It'll be better for you if you tell the truth than be found out later." "I am telling the truth." "I won't warn you again," Otto Houlihan said, his voice losing its silkiness. "Where did you steal it from?" "I didn't steal it," Candy said. "I told you I didn't know I had it." "Wolfswinkel tells me he found it in your thoughts. Are you telling me he's a liar?" "No," Candy said. "If that's what he says, then I guess he must have found it there." "But you don't know how it got there?" "No, I don't." The line went quiet for a moment. "Can I go now?" Candy said. "I really don't have anything else to tell you." "Oh, I think you've got plenty more to tell me," Houlihan said, his voice now entirely bereft of its silken quality. There was now a subtle element of threat in his words. "But we'll have plenty of time to talk when I come to fetch you. Put Casper back on. I'll be seeing you very soon." "He wants to talk to you again," Candy said, passing the receiver over to Wolfswinkel. "Are you finished with her?" Wolfswinkel said to Houlihan. The answer was apparently yes, because Wolfswinkel now waved Candy away. She retreated into the next room, relieved that the interrogation was over. Perhaps she might get out, she thought, while Wolfswinkel was occupied by his telephone call. She went over to the window and tried the handle, but it was locked. Outside, rain was falling. It pattered against the little panes of glass. "There's no way out, at least not that way." She looked around. Malingo was hanging upside down from the rafters. She wandered over to him. "Can I trust you?" she said. It was a silly question, of course. If she couldn't, he wouldn't confess to it. But still he nodded, as if he knew what was coming next. "You have to help me," she whispered to him. "I need to get out of here." A pitiful expression crossed Malingo's inverted face. "It's impossible," he said. "You think I haven't tried over the years? But Casper always catches me, and when he catches me, he beats me with his stick. You don't want to have that happen." "I'll risk the beating," Candy said. "This fellow Otto Houlihan is coming to get me, and I really don't want to be here when he arrives." Malingo looked even more distressed. Rocking back and forth from the rafters, he sang a little rhyme. "Houlihan, Houlihan, the crisscross man, the crisscross man. Fetch yourself a holy man. Do it fast, fast as you can, because here comes Houlihan, the crisscross man." "Well, that's not very useful," Candy said. "I need help, and you hang upside down singing songs like a crazy man." "I'm not crazy," Malingo protested. "I'm just tired of being beaten all the time. When I sing my songs, it makes me feel better." He started swinging again, his arms wrapped around his body, a perfect picture of despair. "Listen to me," Candy said, putting her hand on his shoulder to slow his swinging. "We both want the same thing. You want to get out of here, and so do I." "What are you two yabbering about in there?" Wolfswinkel yelled from the next room. "Nothing," Malingo said plaintively. "Nothing? Nobody yabbers about nothing unless they're witless spit-for-brains fools. Is that what you are, Malingo?" Yes, sir." "Well, say it out loud so we can hear you. What are you?" "I've forgotten, sir." "A spit-for-brain fool. Say it. Go on. Say, 'I'm a spit-for-brain fool, sir.'" "You're a spit-for-brain fool, sir." Wolfswinkel slammed down the telephone. "What did you say?" "I mean, I'm a fool, sir. Me. I'm the spit-in-his-eye fool, sir." "You know what I'm doing, Malingo?" "No, sir." "I'm picking up my stick, and you know what that means, don't you?" Candy watched as 2 tears formed in Malingo's eyes and ran down over his forehead, then dropped to the carpet. "Come here, Malingo." "Leave him alone," Candy protested. "You're frightening him." "Keep your mouth shut or you'll be next. Malingo, come here, you little rat spasm." Candy went to the door. "Please, it was me who was doing the talking, not him." Wolfswinkel shook his head. "Why are you standing up for him?" he said. "Oh, I know. You're trying to get him to help you, aren't you?" He smiled, showing his mostly rotted teeth. "Well, let me explain something to you. Malingo's a gesh-rat, and gesh-rats are cowards, even the best of them, and Malingo makes most of his breed look like heroes. Come here, Malingo, right now." Candy heard a soft thump as Malingo dropped from the rafters. A few seconds later he appeared at the door. "Please, sir, no, sir," he said, the words becoming one pitiful appeal. "I said here! Now! If I have to wait one more second—" Malingo didn't attempt to seek clemency any longer. He started to walk toward Wolfswinkel, casting a forlorn glance at Candy as he went, as though being beaten in front of her made the prospect even worse. "On your knees," Wolfswinkel said. "Now! Come to me on your knees. Bare back." Malingo went to his knees and shuffled over to the wizard. "Please," Candy began. "You want to make it worse for him?" Wolfswinkel said coldly. "No," said Candy, "of course not." "Then shut up and watch. You could very well be next. I have absolutely no compunction about beating a member of the fair sex, believe me." "I bet you haven't," Candy thought. At that moment she couldn't imagine despising anyone with the heat of the hatred she felt for Wolfswinkel, but she didn't dare speak her mind, not with Malingo at the bully's feet, about to be beaten for the crime of speaking. "Fetch me a glass of rum, girl," Wolfswinkel said. "And smile, girl, smile." Candy made a pitiful attempt to look cheery. "Now get me my libation. It's on the dresser in the living room. Go!" Candy turned her back and returned to the room where she'd conversed with Malingo. There was a large, elaborately carved dresser set against the far wall. On it sat a crystal decanter of liquor and a small glass. She took the stopper from the decanter. As she did so, she glanced up at the row of 5 paintings lined up on the wall above the dresser. They were all portraits, 2 women and 3 men. Underneath the portraits were the names of those portrayed: Jengle Small, Dr. Inchball, Hetch Heckler, Biddy Stuckmeyer, and Deborah Jibb. There was nothing about the group that suggested they were related or in any way connected, except perhaps for one detail. They were all wearing hats. The same style of hats. No. The same hats. The very same that were now piled somewhat absurdly upon Caspar Wolfswinkel's head. As she took notice of this oddity, she heard the sound of Wolfswinkel's stick whistling through the air and landing on Malingo's back. She winced. A second stroke came quickly after the first, then a third, and a fourth and fifth. Between the blows, she heard the soft sound of Malingo's sobs. She understood those heart-racking tears. She'd shed them herself when her father was done with her. Tears of relief that it was all finished for now. And tears of fear that it would happen again when she least expected it. Her father hadn't used a stick to strike her, but he'd had his own ways to cause pain. Trembling with anger and frustration, she poured the glass of rum, silently wishing the wizard would choke on the stuff, put the stopper back in the decanter, and started to carry the liquor back to Wolfswinkel. The blows kept falling as she walked in, but as she entered, they stopped. Malingo was curled up in a little ball of pain and tears at Wolfswinkel's feet like a punished animal. The magician was out of breath. There was a catarrhal rattle in his chest. "The rum! The rum!" he said, beckoning to Candy. He took the glass from Candy's fingers. "Out of my sight!" he shouted. Malingo scuttled away on all fours, up the wall, through the top of the door, and back, Candy assumed, to his favorite hanging place. Back to his rocking and his song about Houlihan and the Holy Man. Wolfswinkel downed the rum in one gulp. "More, more," he said, proffering the empty glass. "Where's the decanter, girl?" "I didn't bring it." "Didn't bring it, you maggoty clod! Well, get it!" Candy ducked just in time. He swung his staff in her direction. It missed her nose by precious inches. She backed away from the sweating Wolfswinkel before he could aim a second blow at her, and she retreated out of his range. Then, cursing the little man under her breath, using a few choice adjectives she had picked up from her dad, she headed into the next room for the rum decanter. Chapter 28. A Slave's Soul. She had guessed correctly about Malingo. He was indeed rocking from the rafters, his tears running down his brow and soaking the carpet beneath him. "We've got to get out of here," Candy mouthed. He shook his head, his expression one of bottomless despair. Candy picked up the rum decanter and returned to the front room. As she arrived at the door, the telephone rang. Wolfswinkel picked up the receiver, thrusting the empty glass at Candy to have it refilled. He had put down his staff, she saw. It lay across the arms of his chair. What if she threw the decanter at Wolfswinkel, and while he was busy trying to catch it, picked up his staff and made a break for the front door? No, that was no good. Even if she made it out there, and who knew what traps Wolfswinkel had laid around the house to prevent escapees, she'd be leaving Malingo behind. She couldn't do that. Though they had had no more than 2 minutes' worth of conversation, she felt responsible for him. They had to get out together. She poured the wizard some more rum. Wolfswinkel wasn't even noticing what she was doing. Whatever he was being told on the telephone had him absurdly excited. "He wants to talk to me?" he said. "Really?" He downed the glass of rum and thrust it toward Candy to be refilled. She obliged happily. She knew from experience what alcohol did to sharp minds. It dulled them, stupefied them. A drunk magician, she reasoned, was a sluggish magician, which was exactly what she wanted right now. Wolfswinkel emptied the third glass of rum with the same speed as he had the first two, and demanded a fourth. Before he could get it to his lips, however, his whole demeanor changed, and a look of strange reverence came over his face. "My Lord Midnight," he said, "this is indeed an honor, sir." Lord Midnight? Candy thought. He's speaking to Christopher Carrion, the Dark Prince himself. And what was the subject under discussion? Apparently she was. "Yes, my lord, she's here," Wolfswinkel said. "She's right here beside me." There was a pause. "Well, if I may be so bold, sir, she doesn't seem to me in any way an extraordinary creature. She's just a girl, you know. Like most girls, something and nothing." There was another pause while Wolfswinkel listened. "Oh, yes, sir, I spoke to Otto Houlihan. He's on his way to collect the key." Another pause. "And the girl, too?" "Oh, yes, of course. She's yours." He drank the rum and again thrust the glass out to have it refilled, but the decanter was empty. Irritated, Wolfswinkel gestured that Candy should go find some more. She got the impression, judging by the slight trembling in his hands and the twitching under his eye and at his mouth, that though he was honored to be speaking with the Lord of Midnight, he was also intimidated to his cowardly core. Candy went next door in search of the liquor. She didn't have to look far. There was a bottle in the dresser. As she wrestled to unscrew it, her eyes went up to the portraits again. "Who are these people?" she murmured to Malingo. It took the beaten Geshrat a moment to come out of the trance of unhappiness he was in, but when he did, he whispered, "They were all friends of his, members of the Nancian magic circle, but then he swore allegiance to King Rot." "Who?" "Carrion." "Oh, King Rot. I get it. What did he do once he'd sworn allegiance?" "He murdered them." "What? He murdered his own friends?" "Rum!" Wolfswinkel roared. "Why?" "Rum!" Wolfswinkel was at the door now with his empty glass. His face was flushed red with liquor and excitement, like a shiny tomato balanced on top of an overripe banana. "That," he said with an expansive gesture, "was Lord Midnight himself. My liberation, you see, is imminent, all thanks to you." He smiled lopsidedly at Candy, displaying his ill-kept teeth. "It was quite a moment, missy, when you came knocking at my door. You changed my life. Fancy that, huh? Who'd have thought a little ferret's dunghole like you would be the cause of Uncle Casper's liberation?" He walked over and pinched Candy's cheek as if she were a little child and he the indulgent relative. "Give me another glass of rum, girl," he said. "Keep me happy till Otto arrives, and maybe I won't beat you black and blue." Candy took the top off the bottle and poured another brimming glassful. As Wolfswinkel put the glass to his lips, Candy took her life in her hands and deliberately let the bottle slip from between her fingers. It smashed on the floor between them, releasing a pungent stench of rum. "You idiotic!" Candy didn't give Wolfswinkel time to finish his next insult. Instead, she pressed her hands against his chest and pushed. The rum had made Wolfswinkel unsteady on his feet. He staggered to regain his balance, and while he did so, she slipped through the door into the next room. There, still lying across the armchair where he'd left it, was his staff. Without giving herself time to question or doubt the wisdom of what she was about to do, Candy picked it up. The thing vibrated in her grip as though it resented being handled by a stranger, but she refused to let the staff intimidate her. She held onto it and waited for the inevitable reappearance of its owner. Somehow he knew what she had done because he yelled, "Put that down!" even before he appeared at the door. The staff's vibrations became still more violent at the sound of its master's voice, but Candy refused to release it. Wolfswinkel was at the door now, pointing at her. "I said, put that down," Wolfswinkel said, his voice slurred with alcohol. "Put it down or I'll—" "Or what?" Candy said, wielding the stick like a baseball bat. "What will you do, huh? You can't kill me, because then you won't have anything to hand over to your lord and master." Wolfswinkel wiped away the sweat that had popped up all over his forehead and was threatening to run into his eyes. "Malingo!" he yelled. "Get in here right now!" Malingo dutifully crawled in upside down around the top of the door. "Seize that wretch!" Wolfswinkel demanded, "and give me my staff." Malingo hesitated, his despairing eyes on Candy. "I said—" "I heard what you said," Malingo replied. Wolfswinkel took a moment to consider what his slave had just said, or rather the tone of it. There was something new in Malingo's voice, something Wolfswinkel didn't like at all. It called for a new order of threat. "Do as I say, Geshrat, or so help me I'll break every bone in your body." "With what?" Candy reminded him. "I've got your little magic stick." "But you don't know how to use it, missy," Wolfswinkel replied, and before Candy could evade him, he caught hold of the end of the staff. Even drunk on rum, he had a supernatural power in his grip. He twisted the stick to the left, then to the right, then to the left again, attempting to wrest it from Candy's grip. But the more violently he twisted, the harder she held on. "If you don't let go!" he hollered at her, his unpretty face made uglier still by his rage. "Hot air, that's all you are," Candy said. "Hot air in a banana skin suit." Wolfswinkel's lip curled with fury, and he hauled his staff toward him. There was a short scuffle, and in the heat of the moment they both lost their grip on the staff. It fell to the floor between them and rolled off across the boards. Both Candy and Wolfswinkel made a lunge to reclaim it, but before either could reach it, Malingo dropped from the ceiling and neatly snatched it up. A smug smile appeared on Caspar Wolfswinkel's face. "Good boy," he said to Malingo. "You are a very, very good boy. I will think of some way to reward you for this." He wiped his sweaty brow with the arm of his yellow jacket. Then he put out his fat hand. "Now give it back to Uncle Caspar," he said. The beaten Malingo looked at his master like a creature mesmerized by a poisonous snake, but he didn't move to return the staff. "Didn't you hear me?" Wolfswinkel demanded. "Give me my staff! I'm going to beat this wretched girl till she's yelping. Won't that be fun?" There was a long, long moment in which nothing happened. Then slowly, very, very slowly, Malingo shook his head. "Candy?" he said quietly, not for a moment taking his eyes off the man who had once been his master. "You'd better go. Quickly, before Houlihan gets here." "I'm not leaving without you." At this, Malingo shot her a glance filled with a mixture of fear and exhilaration. "Oh, how sweet this is," Wolfswinkel remarked. "How touching." Then, putting on a smile, he beckoned to Malingo. "Come on now, boy. Joke's over. You've had your moment. Let's stop all this play-acting. You know you don't have the guts to leave me." His tone was all milk and honey, and it was frighteningly credible. "You belong to me, Malingo," he went on. "Remember? I bought you in an honest transaction. I have the papers. You can't walk away. I mean, goodness gracious, where would the world be if every slave just upped and walked away when they got the inclination?" The smile went from his face. Wolfswinkel had exhausted his supply of sweetness. "Now," he said, "for the last time, give me back my staff, and I promise you, I will not hurt you." Malingo didn't move. He didn't even blink. "Oh, now, wait a moment," Wolfswinkel went on. "I know what you're thinking. You can smell freedom, can't you? And it's rather tempting. But think, Geshrat. You don't know how to live out there in the world." "Take no notice of him," Candy said. "You've got a slave's soul, Geshrat, and you'll never change that." "There's nothing to be afraid of out there," Candy said. Then, revising her opinion in the interest of honesty, she said, "Well, nothing's worse than this, than him, and I'll be with you." "Oh, no, you won't," Wolfswinkel said, snatching hold of Candy's wrist. His grip was like fire. She cried out in pain and struggled so hard to be free of him that his hats, all carefully perched upon one another, slid sideways from his sweat-slickened head. A look of panic crossed his face, and he let go of Candy so as to catch the falling hats and push them back into place. She stepped out of his range, her hand numb with pain. As she rubbed it back to life, the paintings of the 5 murdered magicians came into her mind's eye. And with them, a simple thought. His hats. Part of his power is in those idiotic hats. She had only a moment to register this notion. Then Wolfswinkel was closing on Malingo, his hands reaching out to reclaim his staff. "Give it to me," he said to Malingo. "Come on, you know it's mine." There were flecks of yellow-white spittle on his lips. He looked as though he was about ready to explode with fury. Malingo raised the staff. "Good boy," Wolfswinkel said, a slight smile returning to his sweaty face. Malingo looked his master straight in the eyes. Then he lifted his leg, and taking the staff in a 2-handed grip, he brought it down across his knee. Wolfswinkel let out a howl as the staff broke in half. Splinters flew in all directions, and the crack of the breaking staff echoed off the walls. Malingo lifted the pieces of the staff and showed them to Wolfswinkel. "You'll never beat me with this again," he said. Then he threw the 2 halves down on the floor, on the very spot where he'd been bruised and humiliated just a few minutes before. Wolfswinkel looked down at them, his body shaking. "Well now," he muttered, "aren't you a brave little rebel?" Now it was he who lifted his hands, locking his fingers together above his head. Then, muttering something that was incomprehensible to Candy's ears, but still sounded profoundly threatening, he unknotted his hands and began to slowly ease them apart. There was a form made of seething darkness between his palms which grew as he parted his hands. It resembled a fat, 5-foot-long maggot armed with tentacles, each one of which ended in a cruel red hook. It had 2 heads, one at either end of its body, their faces resembling Casper. Their teeth were as sharp as a shark's teeth. "Lovely," Wolfswinkel said, looking up at this foul thing that he'd conjured. "You like my little Iriac?" Then, without waiting for a reply, he dropped his hands in front of him and released the creature. The Iriac, though solid, seemed to be able to defy gravity, for it instantly rose high above the heads of those in the room, twisting and turning like a rope that had an ambition to knot itself. It made an inverted curve of its body and turned both its grotesque faces down to look at its creator. Wolfswinkel nodded to the thing. "Are you ready?" he said. It opened its mouths and let out a hiss from the depths of its throats. "Good," said Wolfswinkel. He pointed at Malingo and uttered these words. "Kill my slave." The Iriac didn't hesitate. It threw itself down from the heights of the room and flew toward Malingo. Luckily, Malingo was quick. He was used to climbing over the rooms. He knew every rock and cranny. Before the Iriac could reach him, up he went like a spider on the wall. The creature pursued him, the hooks on its numberless tentacles striking sparks off one another, bright enough to flood the room with a rancid light. Wolfswinkel was pleased with the spectacle he'd created. He applauded like an egotistical child as the chase set the chandelier swinging. A dry rain of dust and dead moths came down off the crystals as they twinkled and shook. "Get out!" Malingo yelled down to Candy. "Go!" The moment that he took to beg her to leave was his undoing. The creature closed the distance between them in a heartbeat and clamped both sets of jaws upon him. Candy couldn't bear to look. She averted her eyes, her gaze going instead to Wolfswinkel. He was totally engrossed by the spectacle overhead. Surely she could creep up on him and not be noticed. Did she dare? Yes, of course she dared. Anything to save Malingo from Wolfswinkel's monster. She glanced up once to see how Malingo was faring. Not well, was the answer. The Iriac was wrapped around Malingo, its hooks seeking to catch his skin, but he wasn't quite as vulnerable as a human being. Though doubtless his skin was tender from the beating he'd endured, the hooks didn't wound him. Even so, he was in dire jeopardy, not from the hooks, but from the Iriac's teeth. He did his best to hold the beast's 2 mouths away from his face with his hands, and for a while he succeeded. said. But the Iriac was strong. It was only a matter of time before the monster's needle teeth pierced him. Candy waited no longer. As Wolfswinkel continued to applaud the horrible spectacle, Candy moved behind him. Then she pitched herself at his back. Wolfswinkel turned at the last moment and raised his hand to strike her, but he was too late. She threw herself at him, and with a backward sweep of her hand, she knocked all of his hats off his head. Wolfswinkel unleashed a howl of fury and went down on his knees in a desperate attempt to pick up the fallen hats. Candy did her best to prevent him from doing so by kicking them out of his hands. From overhead there came a din like the sound of an enormous firecracker exploding. Candy looked up to see that the Iriac was no longer threatening Malingo. With Wolfswinkel's power suddenly removed, the Iriac was diminishing. It had let Malingo go and was bouncing back and forth around the room like an overfilled balloon that had suddenly had the air let out of it. As it struck a solid object, a wall of books, the chandelier, a table, the floor, it erupted in a shower of black sparks, its body getting smaller each time it did so. Candy watched it for a moment, then she called up to Malingo, who was still hanging on the ceiling. "Come on, quickly!" He dropped down to stand in front of her. "Are you all right?" she said. "It didn't hurt me," he smiled. "It tried, but—" Candy smiled and caught hold of his clammy hand. "We have to get out of here," she said, and they ran toward the front door. As they reached the door, the beast slammed into the wall above it and released one last stinging rain of black sparks. Then it dropped to the ground between them. It was deflated to a tiny version of its former self. It writhed on the floor, its minuscule mouth still loosing that throaty hiss. "Look away," Malingo said. "Don't worry, I'm not squeamish," Candy said. Malingo stamped his heel down on the Iriac, grinding out the last of its magical life. When he lifted his foot, the creature was no more than a dark stain on the carpet. "Now we go," Malingo said. He pulled open the top bolt of the front door. Candy took the middle and the bottom. "Wait, what about the key?" she said to Malingo as she threw open the door. "This isn't the time to be worrying about that," Malingo said as Casper's din became louder behind them. Candy agreed with a little nod, and hand in hand they pitched themselves over the threshold. They didn't look over their shoulders. They just stumbled away from the house into the early night of Ninnyhammer, leaving Casper Wolfswinkel to roar his threats and his frustration at their backs.
This ends Disc 7. Abarat, Disc 8.
Chapter 29. Cat's Eyes. "I'm free!" Malingo yelled as they ran. "I can't believe it! I'm free! I'm free!" Suddenly he stopped running and picked Candy up in his arms, hugging her so tightly she could barely catch her breath. "Thank you, thank you, thank you," he said, swinging her around. "You gave me the courage to do it. Whatever happens to me after this, I'll always be grateful to you." Then he planted a loving, leathery kiss on her cheek and set her down again. Candy was a bit flustered by all this. She couldn't remember the last time she'd been hugged or kissed, but she quickly regained her composure and turned the conversation back to practical matters. "We're not out of the woods yet," she pointed out. "We need to put as much distance as we can between us and old Banana Suit." Malingo laughed. "Agreed," he said. "Do you have a boat?" "No, and I don't suppose you have a luxury yacht in the vicinity." "No, afraid not. How did you get here, by the way?" "Well, there was this giant moth, you see," she said. "Giant moth?" "Sent by Christopher Carrion." "So the Lord of Midnight has been after you for a while. What's he so interested in?" "Well, I had this key," Candy began. Then she stopped herself. "But that can't be why he was after me. He didn't even know I had the key until Wolfswinkel found it. Do you know what this mystery key is for?" "No, I don't. I don't think I was ever told." Candy had no sooner spoken than she heard the voice of Casper Wolfswinkel. He was somewhere nearby, to judge by the way he whispered. "Oh, the key," he said. "You want to know what the key is for?" Malingo turned to Candy, the joy stripped from his face, terror replacing it. "He's here," he said. "It's all right," Candy murmured. "He's not going to hurt us." As she spoke, she looked around for some sign of Wolfswinkel in the murk, but despite the eerie intimacy of his voice, he was nowhere to be seen. For your information, the magician went on, the key opens the pyramids of Zugzugs. Really? Candy said, hoping to keep the chat going while she tried to locate Wolfswinkel. The pyramids, huh? Very interesting. She leaned close to Malingo. Let's stand back to back, she said. That way he can't creep up on us. Malingo did as she suggested and carefully stepped into place, his back against Candy's. Believe me, Wolfswinkel went on boastfully, I will be massively rewarded for what I did this hour. I will have power on a scale that would be unimaginable to the likes of you. Where is he? Candy whispered to Malingo. He's close. I know he's close. Why can't we see him? It's driving you crazy, isn't it? Wolfswinkel said. You're wondering if your pitiful senses are finally giving out? Perhaps you're going crazy. Have you thought about that? What is it the poet says? The mind cannot bear too much reality. You poor thing. It's the madhouse for you. Malingo seized hold of Candy's hand. You are not going crazy, he said. Then why does he sound so close to us? Malingo was trembling violently. Because he is close, he said. He's very close. But I don't see him, Candy said, still inspecting the landscape around them. Those hats of his give him a lot of powers, Malingo whispered. He's just made himself invisible. So he could be anywhere? Candy said. I'm afraid so. Armed with this new information, Candy studied the landscape around them for some sign, however subtle, of their enemy's presence. A bush shaking as Wolfswinkel brushed past it, a pebble cracking beneath his invisible heel. But in the flickering, deceptive light from the fire poles, it was difficult to be sure of anything. Was that Wolfswinkel moving through the grass off to her left, or just a trick of the light? Was that his breath close to her ear, or simply the wind? I hate this, she whispered. She'd no sooner spoken than there was a loud slapping sound, and Malingo stumbled forward, crying out. He instantly let go of Candy's hand and swung around, raising his fists like an old-fashioned boxer. He's right here, Malingo warned. He's right here! He just hit the back of my... He didn't finish. There was another smack, and then a third, this one so violent that it threw Malingo to the ground. He put his hands over his head to protect himself from any further assault. Run, Candy! He yelled. Get out of here before he starts on you! At this point, Candy felt Casper's arms catching hold of her, and she was lifted up into the air. It was a supernatural strength Wolfswinkel was displaying. The source of it, of course, those ridiculous hats of his. Candy flailed around, hoping by chance to knock them off his head again, but he had her held in such a position that she was powerless to do so. You're coming back to the house with me, he said. Right now! Candy continued to struggle, but the man's strength was simply overwhelming. She started to yell for help, hoping there might be somebody out there on the murky slopes that could save them. It's a lost cause, I'm afraid, Wolfswinkel said, his invisible mouth inches from Candy's ear. His breath stank of rum. Before Candy could reply, there was a lot of motion in the grass around them, and out of the darkened landscape came a number of tarry cats. It wasn't a small assembly. 1 minute the place was deserted, the next the beasts seemed to be all around them, their ears pricked, their eyes incandescent, watching Candy intently as she struggled in the arms of her invisible captor. As they approached, she remembered the horrendous crimes Wolfswinkel had claimed the cats had been responsible for. Had any of what he'd told her been true? Had the tarry cats come here now to commit some new atrocity? To leap on poor Malingo while he lay on the ground and scratch out his eyes, or to climb up her body and smother her? As if their situation wasn't bad enough, it had now become incalculably worse. Or so she thought. But as the tarry cats advanced upon them, she felt Casper's hold on her weaken a little, and a few muttered words escaped his lips. You stay away from me, he warned them. The tarry cats ignored him. They simply continued their approach, their scrutiny frighteningly intense. Don't look at me that way, Wolfswinkel said to them. Look at me, Candy thought. What did he mean by look at me? He was invisible, surely. How could they possibly be seeing him? Suddenly, it was clear to Candy. They can see you, she said to Casper. The magician made no reply, but he didn't need to. His body was answering for him. He'd begun to shake, and his grip on Candy had weakened so much that she was able to slip free of him. She went immediately to tend to Malingo, who was still curled up on the ground. "It's all right," she reassured him. "The Terry cats are here." "That's good," he said, turning over to look at her. There was blood and fear on his face. "Oh, yes, it's good," she said. "How so?" "Because the Terrys can see him, Malingo." "They can?" They both looked up. The animals' eyes were all focused on the same spot, just a few feet from Candy and Malingo, and from that exact place came Wolfswinkle's voice. "You keep your distance, you spit rags!" he wailed at the Terrys. "Stay away, I'm warning you, or I'll set fire to your tails. I mean it. You don't know the things I can do to the likes of you." A few of the Terrys exchanged anxious glances at Wolfswinkle's outburst, but none of them were intimidated enough to retreat. "He's bluffing," Candy said to them. "Do you understand me? He's afraid of you." "You be quiet, Bugrot," Wolfswinkle yelled, his voice shrill now. "I'll deal with you later." Malingo, meanwhile, had got to his feet. The blood was running down the side of his face from the wound on his brow, but he seemed indifferent to his own hurt. There was a strange new confidence about him. "You know all you ever do is threaten people," he said, striding toward the place where the many stares of the Terry cats converged. In other words, the spot where the wizard stood. Wolfswinkle said nothing more, presumably hoping to keep his ex-slave's hands from touching him. Then he beat a rapid retreat. Candy and Malingo could hear the dirt his heels kicked up, and they could see the collective gaze of the Terrys moving up the slope, following the magician as he fled for the sanctuary of his house. Malingo wasn't about to let him get there. He chased Wolfswinkle up the slope, glancing back at the animals now and again to confirm that he was indeed running in the right direction. He was 20 yards shy of the front door when he pounced. There was a loud, profoundly outraged yell from the merc. "Unhand me, slave!" Wolfswinkle yelled. "I'm not your slave!" Malingo yelled back. Clearly, Wolfswinkle fought to be free of Malingo's hold. It looked as though Malingo was wrestling with 2 armfuls of invisible eels, all slathered in fat. Threats and curses poured from Wolfswinkle. Tired of the wizard's endless mouthing, Malingo shook his prisoner back and forth. "Show yourself!" he demanded. He had grabbed Wolfswinkle's neck, as far as Candy could guess, and was threatening to choke him. "Take the hats off and show yourself!" he demanded. A moment later, a flickering form began to appear in Malingo's arms, and an irate Caspar Wolfswinkle came into view. He had taken off his hats, and he was clutching 3 in each hand. By the expression on his face, he would gladly have murdered every living thing on Ninnyhammer at that instant, starting with Candy and Malingo, then going on to the Terrys. "So now, Caspar," said a voice behind Candy, "you should perhaps go back to your house and stay there. You know you're not supposed to be running around." Candy turned, wondering who the speaker was, and found herself face to face with a 2-legged creature who had clearly some familial relationship with the Terrys. Its wide face was covered with a subtle down of reddish-brown fur. Its luminous eyes were decidedly feline, as were the whiskers that sprouted from its cheeks. It had apparently wandered up the hill to see what was going on. "She started all this, Jimothy," Caspar said, pointing at Candy. "That damnable girl! Blame her, not me." "Oh, for a Zoe's sake, be quiet, Wolfswinkle," the creature said. Much to Candy's surprise, Wolfswinkle did exactly that. The creature returned its gaze to Candy. "My name is Jimothy Terry. I'm very pleased to meet you. And you, of course, are the famous, or is it infamous, Candy Quackenbush. You know of me? There have been very few visitors to these islands whose presence has been so widely discussed," Jimothy said. "Really? Oh, certainly." He smiled, showing his pointed teeth. "I've been out among the islands these last 2 days, and it seems every second soul I met knows of you. Your celebrity grows by the hour. People who can't possibly have met you claim they have." "Really?" said Candy. "Believe me. Did you buy a slice of farini from the cheesemaker in Outland?" "No." "Well, he says you did. What about the shoes you ordered from a cobbler in Tasmagor? I've never even been to Tasmagor. You see how famous you are? Jimothy said. I don't understand why, Candy said. Well, there are several good reasons, Jimothy said. One, of course, is your origins. You're the first soul to have come through from the hereafter in quite a while. Then there's the fact that you seem to have left consternation wherever you traveled. Admittedly, none of this was of your doing. Others were causing trouble by pursuing you with such vehemence. But trouble is trouble. Candy sighed, still confused. And then, said Jimothy, there's the matter of when you arrived. Why's that so important? Well, because a lot of people, from street corner elegiacs to the most respected bonecasters in the Aberrat, have been saying for a long time that some transforming force was imminent, a force that would somehow upset the sad order of our lives. Why sad? Said Candy. What's so sad about things? Where do I begin? Jimothy said softly. Put it this way. We do not sleep well these days. We? Those of us who care to wonder where our lives are going and what our dreams are worth. We wake with the taste of midnight in our throats. You mean Christopher Carrion? He's part of it, but he's not the worst part of it, Jimothy said. After all, the House of Carrion has had its place in the balance of power since there were historians to write these things down. Darkness has always had its part to play. Without it, how would we know when we walked in the light? It's only when its ambitions become too grandiose that it must be opposed, disciplined, sometimes, if necessary, brought down for a time. Then it will rise again, as it must. In the end, following the dark road is no less honorable than following the light, as long as it's done with a clear purpose. Candy wasn't sure she entirely understood what she was being told, but she was sure when she thought it all over that Jimothy's observations would come to make sense. Anyway, she had no chance to ask the Tarry Cat questions. Jimothy was continuing to talk about the state of the Aberrat, and Candy drank it all down. The real trouble is Comexo, he said. Rojo Pixler and his kid. He buys holy sites and builds restaurants on them, and nobody seems to care. They're too busy drinking his panacea. It makes me sick. Hour by hour, day by day, we're letting him take the magic out of our lives. And what do we get in exchange? Soda and panacea. He shook his head in despair. Do you begin to understand? He said. A little, Candy said. And now here you come out of the hereafter, and the moment you arrive, everybody starts to talk. Everybody starts to wonder, is she the one? The one? To cure our ills, to save us from our own stupidities, to wake us up. Candy had no answer to this except to say, no, she wasn't the one. She was a nobody. But Jimothy didn't want to hear that, she knew, so she kept her silence. You are an extraordinary spirit, he said to her. Of that I am certain. Candy shook her head. How can that... me? She sighed, the words failing her, just as she knew she would fail Jimothy's high hopes for her. How could she wake up anybody? She'd been asleep herself until a few days ago, doodling in her dreams. Take courage in your purpose, Jimothy said, even if it isn't yet clear. Candy nodded. It's amazing that you've survived your journey thus far. You do know that? Somebody must be taking care of you. His observation brought to mind all that Candy had faced in the hours since she had met John Mischief, narrowly avoiding death at the hands of Mendelssohn Shape and nearly drowning in the Sea of Isabella. The bolts of Pixler's hunting party whistling past her head, then falling out of the skies, clinging to the corpse of the great moth. Finally, of course, there'd been her encounter with Wolfswinkel. Everywhere she looked, there was jeopardy. This all began with a key, she said, trying to make sense of what had brought her to this moment. And Wolfswinkel took it out of my mind. Can you get it back from him? Unfortunately, there's nothing I can do about that. Although Wolfswinkel is a prisoner and I am his warden, I have no authority to take back what he has taken from you, any more than I can confiscate his hats." "Why not?" Here, Wolfswinkel, who had once again set his hats upon his head, spoke up. "Because I'm a great magician and a doctor of philosophy, and he's just a flea-bitten tarry who happens to stand on two legs. He can't do anything to me except prevent me from getting off this wretched island, and all of that will change when Otto Houlihan gets here." "Houlihan," Candy said. She'd been so engrossed in listening to Jimothy she'd forgotten Houlihan. "What business does that wicked man have with you?" Jimothy asked. It was Wolfswinkel who replied, "Arrangements have been made to have him take her to the Lord Midnight along with the key she stole." "Go back to your house, wizard," Jimothy said, waving Wolfswinkel away. "I don't want to hear any more of you. Brothers and sisters, take him." The cats, which had followed Wolfswinkel up the hill, gathered around him now, yowling as they pressed him back toward his prison. "Damnable creatures," Casper said. Then, calling back to Candy, "Why couldn't you just have poisoned them when I asked you to?" The cats set up a chorus of yowling that blotted out whatever else he had to say. "He's a lunatic," Candy said. "Maybe," Jimothy replied, though he sounded doubtful. "I'm sorry you had to deal with him, but in the end he's a very small player in a very large game." "Who's organizing the game?" Candy wanted to know. "Christopher Carrion?" "I'd rather not talk about him, if you don't mind," Jimothy said. "I believe the more you talk about death and darkness, the closer it comes." "I'm sorry," Candy said. "This is all my fault." "How so?" "Because I let that man have the key. I should have fought him harder." "No, lady," Malingo said, speaking for the first time since this whole exchange had begun. "He calls me lady," Candy thought, "like John Mischief. That's nice." "You're not responsible," Malingo went on. "He had a spell of revelations on you. Nobody could have resisted something like that. At least, nobody who was not a magician." "He's right," Jimothy said. "Don't blame yourself. It's a waste of energy." Up on the hill, Wolfswinkel slammed the door to his house. His threats and inanities were finally silenced, and so was the barrage of yowling that the tarry cats had set up to drown him out. All that remained was the moan of the wind in the long grass. Its sighing put Candy in mind of home, of the tall grass prairie around Chickentown. She suddenly felt a pang of loneliness. It wasn't that she necessarily wanted to be back in the confines of Followell Street. It was just that the distance between this windy place and that modest little house seemed so immeasurably immense. Even the stars were different here, she remembered. Lord, even the stars. Whatever this world was, a waking dream, another dimension, or simply a corner of creation that God had made and forgotten, she was going to have to find herself a place in it and make sense of why she was here. If she didn't, her loneliness would grow and consume her in time. "So what happens to me now?" she said. "A very good question," Jimothy replied. Chapter 30. Come Thou Glyph to Me. "Our first priority," Jimothy said, "is to get you both off this island before Otto Houlihan arrives. I don't want to see you taken to Christopher Carrion." "Do you happen to have a boat?" Candy asked him. "Yes, I do," Jimothy said. "Cats hate to swim, but I'm afraid the boat's way off over on the other side of the island. If we tried to get you to it, Houlihan would have caught up with you before you were halfway to the harbor." I have an idea," Malingo put in tentatively. "You do?" Jimothy said. "Go on," Candy said. "Let's hear it." Malingo licked his lips nervously. "Well," he said, "we could leave the island in a glyph." "A glyph?" Jimothy said. "My friend, it's a fine proposal, but who among us has the knowledge to speak a glyph into creation?" "Well," said Malingo, looking modestly down at his oversized feet, "I do." Jimothy looked frankly incredulous. Where in the name of Gosh and Divinium does a Geshrat learn how to conjure a glyph? When Wolfswinkel used to pass out from drinking an excess of rum, Malingo explained, I would read his books of magic. He has all of the classics up there in the house. Saturansky's Grimoire, The Strata Pilot's Guide, The Wiles of Gawk, Chicanery and Guising. But it was Limerick 6 that I really studied. What are Limerick 6? Candy asked. They are 7 books of incantations and profound enchantments, Jimothy said. If there's 7 books, why are they called Limerick 6? It was Limerick's way of helping a true magician to quickly discover if they were dealing with a false one. Candy smiled. That's clever, she said. There is another way, Malingo said. What's that? Jimothy wanted to know. Just ask whether Limerick was a man or a woman. And what's the right answer? Candy asked. Both, Malingo and Jimothy replied at the same moment. Candy looked confused. Limerick was a mutep, Malingo explained. Therefore, both a he and a she. So, said Jimothy, obviously still a little suspicious of Malingo's claim to the skill of glyph speaking, you've read the books. But have you actually done any of the magic? Malingo made a little shrug. Some small spells, he said. I got a chair to sit up and beg one time. Candy laughed, amused by the image. And I made 14 white doves into one very big white dove. Ha! Said Jimothy, apparently suddenly convinced. I've seen that dove of yours. It's the size of a tiger kite, enormous. That was your handiwork? Yes, it was. You swear? If he says it's his work, Jimothy, then it's his, Candy said. I believe him. I'm sorry, that was remiss of me, Jimothy replied. Please accept my apologies. This was plainly the first time Malingo had been offered an apology. Oh, he said, looking at Candy, his eyes wide. What do I do now? Accept the apology if you think he means it. Oh, yes, of course. I accept the apology. Jimothy offered his hand, and Malingo shook it, plainly delighted at this new proof of his advanced position in the world. So, my friend, Jimothy said, I believe you have it in you to make a glyph. Go to it. I did tell you I've never actually done this before, Malingo pointed out. Just give it a try, Candy said. It's our only way out. No pressure, of course. Malingo offered her a nervous smile. You'd better both stand back then, he said, spreading his arms. Jimothy took a small telescope from his jacket pocket, opened it up, and wandered away to scan the skies. Don't be nervous, Candy said to Malingo. I have faith in you. You do? Don't sound so surprised. I just don't want to disappoint you. You won't. If it works, it works. If not, she waved the thought away. We'll find some other escape route. After all that you've done in the last few hours, you don't have to prove anything. Malingo nodded, though he looked far from happy. To judge by his expression, Candy guessed that a part of him was regretting that he'd spoken up in the first place. He stared down at the ground for a moment as though recalling the spell. Please stand away, he said to Candy without looking up. Then he raised his arms from his sides and clapped them together above his head 3 times. Ithni asme ara, Ithni manami drutha ladakata. Come thou glyph to me. Ithni, Ithni, asme ara, come thou glyph to me. While he spoke these words, he walked in a circle about 6 or 7 feet wide, grabbing hold of the air and appearing to throw what he'd caught into the circle. Then he began the words of the ritual afresh. Ithni asme ara, Ithni manami, drutha ladakata. come thou glyph to me." 3 times he made the circle, throwing the air and repeating the strange words of the conjuration. "Ithni, ithni, asme ara, come thou glyph to me." "I don't want to hurry you," Jimothy said, glancing back at Candy, his eloquent eyes flickering with anxiety, "but I can see the lights of 3 glyphs coming this way. It must be the crisscross man. I'm afraid you don't have much time, my friend." Malingo didn't break the rhythm of his invocation. He went on, around and around, snatching at the air, but nothing seemed to be happening. From the corner of her eye, Candy caught sight of Jimothy making a tiny, despairing shake of his head. She ignored his pessimism and instead went to stand with Malingo. "Is there only room for 1 cook in this kitchen?" she said. He was still circling and snatching, circling and snatching. "The pot looks pretty empty to me," Malingo said. "I need all the help I can get." "I'll do what I can," Candy said, stepping into the circle behind Malingo, copying his every move and syllable. "Ithni asme ara, ithni manami." It was remarkably easy once she'd done it 1 time through. In fact, it was eerily easy, like a dance step she'd forgotten but remembered again immediately the music began, though where she'd heard the music of this magic before, she couldn't possibly imagine. This was not a dance they danced in Chickentown. "I think it's working," Malingo said hesitantly. He was right. Candy could feel a rush of kindled air coming out of the middle of the circle, and to her amazement she saw a myriad of tiny sparks igniting all around them, blue and white and red and gold. Malingo let out a triumphant whoop, and his happiness seemed to further fuel the fire of creation. Now the sparks began to trail light, forming a luminescent matrix in the dark air. The glyph being conjured was a complex form dominated by 3 broad strokes between which there was a filigree of finer lines. Some rose up to form a kind of cabin. The rest swept down behind the craft where they knotted themselves together, forming something that might have been the glyph's engine. Moment by moment it looked more solid. In fact, it now seemed so substantial it was hard to imagine that the space it now occupied had been empty just a little time before. Candy looked over at Jimothy, who was staring with naked astonishment at what Malingo had achieved. "I take it all back, my friend," he said. "You are a wizard. Perhaps the first of your tribe to speak a glyph into creation, yes?" Malingo had stopped circling. He now also stood back to admire the vehicle that was being called into existence. "We are both wizards," he said, looking at Candy with a stare that contained surprise and delight in equal measure. Jimothy was once again consulting the skies through his telescope. "I think it's time for you to go," he said. "There's still more to do," Candy said, looking at the unfinished glyph. "It should finish itself," Malingo told her. "At least that's what Lumeric writes." Lumeric the Mutep knew its business. As Candy watched, the glyph continued to become more and more coherent, the lines of light running back and forth, knitting the matter of the vehicle, refining its form. But it was taking its own sweet time, and that was the problem. "Is there no way to hurry it up?" Jimothy said. "Not that I know of," Malingo replied. Candy glanced in the direction of the approaching enemy. She could now see the glyphs Jimothy had spoken of, all 3 considerably more elaborate than the vehicle that she and Malingo had conjured. But a craft was a craft. As long as it could carry them, it scarcely mattered what it looked like. As she watched, Houlihan's trio came in to land on a ridge perhaps 400 yards from them. There they sat, looking like predatory animals. "Why did they land over there?" Candy asked Jimothy. "Because Houlihan is a military man. He sees traps and ambushes everywhere. He probably thinks we've got an army of 10,000 tarry-cats hiding behind the hill. How I wish we had them. I'd tear him and his Myers to pieces." "Myers? What are Myers?" The creatures he brought with him. They're a particularly brutal breed of stitchling." Candy was just about to ask Jimothy if she could take a look through his telescope to see these mires when a voice they all hoped had been silenced, at least for a while, echoed across the island. "There's nothing to be nervous about, Houlihan. There's only 3 of them, and a few cats." It was Wolfswinkle, of course. Candy glanced around at the house. The wizard had appeared in the dome, which functioned as a giant magnifying glass, grotesquely distorting Wolfswinkle's face and body. It was as though he was being reflected in a vast funhouse mirror. His head bulged and his body looked dwarfed, so that he resembled an infuriated fetus dressed in a banana skin suit. "Come and get them, Houlihan!" he screamed, pounding his tight red fists against the glass. "They're weaponless! Kill the Geshrat! He's a mutinous slave! And beat that girl! Teach her a lesson!" "I really hate that little man," said Candy. "There's a lot worse than him, I'm afraid," Jimothy replied. "Such as?" "Try the crisscross man," Jimothy said. "The list of his crimes are so long we could be here till the sun comes up over Ninnyhammer." Candy licked her parched lips and went back to studying the glyph. It was still polishing itself, much to her frustration. Malingo was also staring hard at it, as though he was trying to will it to finish its auto-creation. "What about you, Jimothy?" Candy said to the Tarry man. "If we get away, what happens to you?" "I'll be fine and dandy," Jimothy said. "Houlihan won't touch me. He knows where to draw the line." "You're sure?" "I'm sure," said Jimothy. "Don't worry about me." "Oh, Azo! He's coming." Candy returned her gaze to the ridge. Houlihan and his gang of Myers had vacated their glyphs and were approaching, confident, thanks to Wolfswinkle, that they had nothing to fear. Houlihan wore a long purple coat with a blood-red lining. His face was faintly jaundiced, and there seemed to be a checkerboard design tattooed upon his cheeks. The 7 Myers that followed on his heels were all bigger than he was, the largest nearly twice his size. Like all their vile species, they were patchworks of flesh and fabric, all crudely sewn together. Their heads, however, were of inhuman design, like the skeletal remains of devils with horns and snouts and vicious teeth. They all carried elaborately configured blades. 3 of them carried 1 in each hand. All in all, it was a terrifying spectacle. "How much longer?" she asked Malingo. "I don't know," the Geshrat replied. Then, with a little puff of pride, "It's my first." He glanced up at the approaching posse. "I suppose we could get in it now, but I'm afraid it would decay and we'd fall out of it." At this juncture, there came a shout from Houlihan. "Candy Quackenbush!" he hollered. "You are under arrest by order of Christopher Carrion." Jimothy laid a light hand on Candy's shoulder. "I'll get the Tarries to do what we can to delay him," he said. "Safe voyages, lady. It is my sincerest hope that we meet again when matters are not so rushed. Goodbye, Malingo. A pleasure, truly." So saying, he started away, then returned to tell Candy, "If you should get caught, now or at any time, take courage. I don't believe Carrion wants your life. He has some other purpose for you." He didn't linger for a reply. There was no time. Houlihan was no more than 30 strides away. "Brothers and sisters," Jimothy called, "come to me! Come!" At his summons, the tarry cats appeared from the gloom and followed on his heels. There were only a dozen or so at first, but then, miraculously appearing from the long grass, came 2 or 3 dozen more. Jimothy Tarry positioned his feline soldiers directly in Houlihan's path. The crisscross man raised his hand and brought his Myers to a halt. "Jimothy Tarry," he said. "Surprise, surprise. I didn't expect to meet the scum of Highslatter here. I thought they'd rounded up all of you strays and put you out of your misery." Jimothy ignored the insult. He just said, "You can't have her, Houlihan. It's as simple as that. She's not going to Carrion. I won't let you take her." They spoke, Candy thought, like the most ancient of enemies, their words steeped in the curdled blood of old feuds. "She's a trespasser, Terry," Houlihan replied, "and a thief, and the Lord of Midnight demands that she be delivered directly to him." "You don't understand, Houlihan. The girl is not going with you." "No, it's you who doesn't understand, animal. This is the law. She's under arrest." "Under what warrant?" "Midnight's warrant." "Ninnyhammer isn't part of Carrion's empire, crisscross man. You know that. His laws mean nothing here. So you go back to him and tell him whatever you like. Tell him she slipped away." "I can't do that," Houlihan said. "He wants her, and he won't be denied. So stand aside, or I'll have to take her by force." "Terrys!" Jimothy yelled suddenly. "Take down the Myers!" The animals needed no further instruction. They surged through the grass like a striped tide and leaped upon Houlihan's faceless crew, climbing their bodies by digging their claws into their coats and attacking their hooded heads. The Myers let out no sound in response, but they used their swords with terrible efficiency. Several of the bravest tarry cats dropped into the grass, slaughtered within seconds. It was a horrible sight. The fact that her presence had brought this battle about tore at Candy's heart. "I have to stop this," she told Malingo. "I won't let this go on. I'll just let Houlihan take me." "No need," Malingo said. "Look." He pointed to the glyph. The process of its construction was finally completed. The vehicle was steaming lightly in the cool evening air, warm from the fever of its creation. "Come on," Malingo urged. "Climb in." As Candy climbed into the vehicle, she yelled to Jimothy Terry, "Call the Terrys off, Jimothy!" He instantly threw back his head and let out a high-pitched yowl. The cats, having done their brave work, and having, in several cases, paid the ultimate price, now retreated from the battlefield. Houlihan led the Myers unopposed toward the glyph, his teeth bared, his eyes blazing. He pointed straight at Candy as he approached. "Don't move, girl!" he roared. "Quickly, lady," Malingo urged. "Say the words." "What words?" "Oh, yes, Neo-Kethica. It means answer my will." "And then what?" "It will answer, hopefully." "I have you, girl!" the crisscross man was yelling. "I have you!" Houlihan was 10 strides away, but one of the Myers, whose headpiece resembled some monstrous bird, had moved ahead of him, clearly intending to stop Candy and Malingo. Luckily, he had lost his weapon in the short battle with the tarry cats, but his arms were enormous, like claws, in fact, with curled silvery talons. There was no response from the glyph. "Neo-Kethica!" Candy said. "Neo-Kethica! Neo-Kethica!" The Mire was almost upon them, reaching out. Suddenly the glyph shuddered. A noise escaped its engine, like the sound of an asthmatic taking a painful breath. Candy saw the Mire's talons inches from her ankle. She lifted her leg to avoid its grip, and as she did so, the glyph miraculously obeyed her instruction. It shuddered and began to rise slowly into the air. The Mire threw itself forward and caught hold of the craft as it ascended. In a matter of seconds, the vehicle was 20, 30, 40 feet off the ground. But the Mire wasn't about to let go. It hung on tenaciously, throwing its body back and forth in a deliberate attempt to unbalance the craft. "He's trying to overturn us," Candy said, grabbing hold of the glyph's armrests. Malingo seized her arm. "I won't let you fall," he said. It was a sweet promise, but in truth it was little reassurance. The Mire was throwing its body around, making the vehicle rock back and forth more violently by the moment. It was only a matter of seconds before its assault succeeded and the craft flipped over. "We have to shake 'em loose," Candy said to Malingo. "What do you suggest?" Malingo replied. "First we have to get that wretched helmet off him. He's on my side, so you hold on to me." She leaned over the edge of the vehicle and grabbed hold of the vicious beak of the Myers headpiece. The creature could do nothing to fend her off. All it could do was cling to the glyph as it tipped and rolled like some lethal funfair ride. "Pull!" Malingo yelled. "I'm doing my best," Candy yelled back. "I need to go farther over the side." "I've got hold of you," Malingo reassured her, grabbing her even more tightly. Candy leaned as far out of the reeling, rocking glyph as her balance would allow. She was now farther out of the vehicle than she was in it. Meanwhile, the glyph continued its unchecked ascent, the wind steadily moving it away from the spot where it had been conjured into being. Wolfswinkle's house was coming into view below. The wizard had apparently witnessed the vehicle's whole giddying climb because his bizarrely magnified head was pressed against the glass dome, his expression demented. Candy ignored Wolfswinkle's wild stare and concentrated on trying to wrench the spiked hood off. Besides its savage beak, the headpiece had countless tiny barbs on its surfaces which pricked and stung her palms. But she refused to let go. She was fighting for their lives here. The Myers seemed to comprehend this too, and was apparently prepared to kill itself in order to bring the glyph down. It thrashed around with incredible violence, but its appetite for destruction was to Candy's purpose. When the mire twisted to the right, she wrenched the headpiece to the left, and when it pulled left, she wrenched right. Finally, as the glyph moved directly over Wolfswinkle's house, there was a series of strange noises from the Myers' skull. First there came a cracking sound, as though a heavy seal were being broken, then a loud, sharp hissing. When Candy pulled the spiked head toward her, there was a third sound, a wet, glutinous noise like a foot being pulled out of a sucking pit. And finally, the Myers' headgear came away in her hand. It was heavy, and she let go of it instantly. It dropped from her hands and tumbled away toward the roof of Wolfswinkle's house, turning over and over until it struck the glass dome below. Now Candy was looking at the mire face to face. The shape of the creature's head was the same shape as its headpiece. The snout and horns were identical. It had no features, no coloration. It was precisely the same gray as its headpiece, except that it glistened horribly like a fresh wound. "Mud," Candy murmured to herself. "It's made of mud." "What?" Malingo yelled over the din of the wind. "It's made of mud," Candy yelled back. Even as she spoke, the mire's head began to lose the shape of its mold. Clots and globs of mud began to detach themselves and fall back through the air toward the dome. The mire stopped struggling as its body, which was entirely made of mud, Candy guessed, all encased in hood, suit, boots, and gloves, began to lose its coherence. Its head collapsed completely, releasing the vile reek of putrefaction. Gobs of mud spattered the dome of Wolfswinkle's house, as though a vast passing bird had defecated on the glass. Headless now, its body full of little shudders and twitches, the mire had little strength left to resist Candy. She began to pry its talons off the edge of the glyph, one by one, and finally the mire's grip on the vehicle slipped. Candy let out a whoop of triumph as the creature fell away, trailing mud from the open wound of its neck. In the shiny glass dome below, Caspar Wolfswinkle saw the mire's body tumbling toward him and began to retreat from the glass, a look of fear crossing his rage-flushed face. He had barely begun his retreat when the great bulk of the mire smashed into the glass. One moment Wolfswinkle was a huge leering presence, his face massively magnified. Then the leaking body hit, and as the glass shattered, Candy and Malingo saw the tyrant as he truly was, a ridiculous little man in a yellow suit. Even his voice, which had echoed across the slopes earlier like the voice of a tyrant, was reduced to a petulant shriek as glass rained down on him. Candy watched as the mire's body hit the tiled floor and broke open like a watermelon dropped from a tall building. Its swampy contents were splattered in all directions. There was no anatomy to speak of, no blood, no bones, no heart or lungs or liver. As she had guessed, The mire was made of mud from head to foot, and although the fleeing Wolfswinkel had attempted to avoid being hit by the contents of the mire's suit, he hadn't retreated fast enough. His yellow jacket was covered in mud, and his long blue shoes were similarly bespattered, their heels slip-sliding under him. He did his best to keep his balance, but he failed. Down he went, falling hard on his backside, his humiliation complete. There was no further for Caspar Wolfswinkel to fall. The last sight Candy had of him before the glyph carried them away from the shattered dome was Caspar Wolfswinkel as the silent comedian, struggling to get to his feet and falling down again, his face now as besmirched as his suit and shoes. The sight made her laugh, and the wind carried her laughter away over the darkened slopes of Ninnyhammer. Jimothy Terry, who was kneeling in the long grass giving the last rites to one of his dying sisters, heard the girl's triumphant laughter, and despite the fact that he had lost 5 of his dearest in the battle with Houlihan's monstrous crew, managed to make a little smile. Otto Houlihan heard the laughter too as he sent his surviving mires back to their glyphs to give chase. He had left 3 of his creatures on the battlefield, their hoods clawed off them by the Terry cats, the stinking mud running out of their suits. He wasn't optimistic that the mires pursuing the girl and the slave in their makeshift glyph would catch up with them. Mires were fearless fighters, but they didn't have brilliant intellects. They needed close instruction, or they rapidly lost their grasp on their purpose. More than likely the clouds over Ninnyhammer would conceal their quarry from them, and after a time they would forget why they were up there and begin circling around. Unless they received fresh directions, they would simply continue to circle and circle and circle until their glyphs ran out of significance and crashed. But Houlihan, though he was sorely tempted, couldn't afford to give chase personally. The girl was important to Carrion, and the key was more important still. His priority was to go back up to the house and get Wolfswinkel to hand the key over. The girl would have to wait. It wouldn't be difficult to find Candy Quackenbush again. She was noticeable, that one. There was something about the eyes, something about the bearing. She'd find it hard to hide. He ascended the little hill on which Wolfswinkel had built his domain and stepped into the chaotic ruins, calling the wizard's name. There was no immediate reply, so he went through the living room and up the stairs to the dome. He'd seen the glass shattering, of course, so he knew what to expect when he got up there. What he didn't anticipate was the sight of Caspar Wolfswinkel standing in his underwear, socks, and mud-smeared blue shoes, staring up at the star-filled sky through the gaping remains of his precious dome. His dirtied clothes lay in a heap on the floor. His near-nakedness was not a pretty sight. "The key," Houlihan said. "Yes, yes," Wolfswinkel said, going to his pile of muddied vestments and searching through the pockets. "I have it here." "You will be rewarded," Houlihan said to him. "I should hope so," Wolfswinkel said, handing the key over to Houlihan. He was trembling, the crisscross man saw. "What's troubling you?" Houlihan said. "Oh, besides all this," Wolfswinkel said, spreading his arms and circling on the spot. "Well, I'll tell you what's troubling me. That girl. What about her? Her presence here is no accident, Otto. You do realize that?" "It's occurred to me. But what's your evidence for this?" "She finds it too easy, Otto." "Easy?" "Being here," said Wolfswinkel. "Back in the old days, before the harbors were closed. You weren't even born, Caspar." "No, but I can read, Otto. And all the books agree it took visitors from the hereafter days, weeks, sometimes months to become acclimatized to being in the Aberrat. If you tried to speed up the process, people went crazy. Their fragile imaginations couldn't take it." "Well, they're weak," Houlihan said. "You're missing the point, Otto, as usual. I'm talking about the girl. This Candy Quackenbush. For her, being here is nothing. She's doing magic as though she was born to it. Born to it, Houlihan! What does that tell you?" "I don't know," Houlihan said. "I'll tell you what it tells me." What? She's been here before! Huh. Well, that's something for Carrion to puzzle out, Houlihan said, plainly not interested in debating the subject with Wolfswinkel. What about me? Casper said. What about you? I found the key and the girl. Then lost her. You let her slip away. It wasn't my fault. That was your damn Myers. They could have had her. Anyway, 2 minutes ago you were telling me I'd be well rewarded. That was before I had the key in my hand. Wolfswinkel's lip curled. You... Now, Casper, no foul language. Accept your error. She was in your charge. What could I do? She turned my slave against me. He broke my staff. That seems rather careless of you, Otto said. What was he doing with your staff in the first place? I was outnumbered by them, Wolfswinkel protested. By a girl and a Geschrat? Wolfswinkel paused. Then, narrowing his eyes, he pointed his fat forefinger at the crisscross man. I know what you're doing, Otto, he said. And what's that? Houlihan replied. You're going to try and take all the glory for yourself and leave me with all the blame. Oh, Casper, you are so paranoid. That is what you're going to do, isn't it? Very possibly, said Houlihan with a little smile. But you can't tell me you wouldn't do the very same thing if you were in a similar situation. Wolfswinkel was defeated. He drew a deep, anguished breath. At least tell Carrion I languish here, he said pitifully. We used to be friends, Otto. Do something for me. Please. I'm afraid our Lord Midnight is a practical man. He has what he needs from you. So now, you're forgotten. It's on to new business. That's not fair. Life's not fair, Casper. You know that. You had a slave for, how long? 12 years. Did you treat him fairly? No, of course not. You beat him when you were in a bad mood because it made you feel better, and when you felt better, you beat him some more. You think you're clever, don't you, Houlihan? Wolfswinkel said, bitter tears of frustration and rage spilling into his eyes. But let me tell you, the hour of your undoing will come. If you don't let me track this girl down and kill her, she'll make such trouble for you. He looked around at the ruins of his precious dome. This is just the beginning. Believe me. Houlihan went to the door. You like playing Prophet of Doom, don't you? You always did, even back in school. Wolfswinkel reached out for this last fragile hope. Ah, school! Otto, do you remember how close we were back then? Were we? Houlihan said. Then, considering the forlorn figure before him, he managed a scrap of compassion. I'll do what I can for you, he said. But I'm making no promises. These are unruly times. Crazy times. All the better. In times like these, a smart man profits. And which of us is the smart one? Houlihan said, smiling. The one standing in his underwear covered in mud, or the man with the key to his master's heaven in his pocket? Never mind, Casper, Houlihan said, walking away from the door, leaving Wolfswinkel in the filth and chaos, unable to cross the threshold without having tarry cats on his throat. All you can do is hope your chance for revenge comes around again, eh? That would be something to look forward to, at least, Wolfswinkel said. Then I'll leave you with this thought, Casper. If I do secure your freedom... Casper turned, the light of hope rekindled in his eyes. Yes, he said. What? Then you must swear now that you will serve me. Be my cook, if I so desire, my knife washer, my floor scrubber. Anything, anything, just get me out of here." "Good. Then we understand each other," Houlihan said, turning away. "Good night to you, Otto." "Good night to you, Casper," said the crisscross man. "And sweet dreams." Chapter 31. The 25th Hour. The trio of Houlihan's glyphs came chasing after Candy and Malingo at considerable speed, but with a little maneuvering, Candy left them behind in a bank of purple-blue cloud. Though she had never driven a vehicle of any kind, besides her bike, which didn't really count, she found the task of piloting the glyph remarkably easy. The craft responded quickly to her will and moved with a grace that pleased her greatly. Once she and Malingo were convinced that their pursuers were not going to put in another appearance, she slowed their frantic pace and guided the glyph down so that they were just skimming the curling waves. That way, if anything unpredictable were to happen to the glyph, if, for instance, it were to decay for some reason, they wouldn't have more than a few feet to fall. It was time for a little mutual congratulation. "The way you conjured this thing," Candy said. "It was amazing. I had no idea." "Well, I wasn't really sure I could do it," Malingo said. "But I guess in a tight squeeze you find out you can do all kinds of things you didn't know you could do. Besides, I couldn't have done it without your help." He grasped Candy's hand. "Thank you." "My pleasure," Candy said. "We make a good team, you and me." "You think so?" "I know so. I'd be on my way to midnight if it weren't for you. And I'd be a slave if it weren't for you. See? A team. I think we should stick together for a while, unless, of course, you've something else you need to do." Malingo laughed. "What would I have to do that was more important than keeping you company?" "Well, I thought now that you're free you'd want to go back and see your family." "I don't know where they are. We were all split up when we were sold." "Who did the selling?" "My father." "Your father sold you to Wolfswinkel?" Candy said, scarcely believing what she was hearing. "No, my father sold me to a slave trader called Caffery Skeller, and he sold me to Wolfswinkel." "How old were you?" 9 3/4, Malingo said, with the precision of a child who'd been asked the same question. "I don't blame my father. He had too many children. He couldn't afford to keep all of us." "I don't know how you can be so forgiving," Candy said, shaking her head. "I wouldn't be able to forgive my father if he did that to me. In fact, there are some things nowhere near as bad as that I can't forgive my father for." "Maybe you'll feel differently when you get back home," Malingo said. "If I ever get back." "You will if you want to," Malingo said. "And I'll help you. My first responsibility is to you." "Malingo, you don't have any responsibility to me." "But I owe you my freedom." "Exactly," said Candy. "Freedom. No more being ordered around by me or anybody else." Malingo nodded as though the notion was very slowly beginning to make sense to him. "Okay," he said. "But what if I want to help you?" "That would be nice. As I said, I think we make a very good team, but it's your choice. And I think I should warn you that it isn't always safe being around me. Ever since I arrived in the Aberrat, it's been one thing after another." "I won't let anything happen to you, lady," Malingo said. "You're too important." Candy laughed. "Me? Important? Malingo, you don't understand. A few days ago, I was a lost schoolgirl from a place called Chickentown." "Whatever you were back there, lady, it's not what you are here. You can make magic." "Yes, that is strange," said Candy, bringing back to mind her strange familiarity with the workings of spells. "So many times on this journey I've felt as though, I don't know, almost as though I'd been here before. Yet I know that's impossible." "Maybe it's in your blood," Malingo suggested. "Maybe a relative of yours came here in the distant past." "That's a possibility," Candy replied. She pictured the faded photographs lined up on the wall of the Almanac Press, the old jetty of Hark's Harbor with its row of stores and the great vessel moored at the quayside. Was it possible that one of the people in that crowd had been a relative of hers? "Wolfswinkle's grandfather used to trade with your people all the time. He made a fortune from it." "Selling what?" "Aberration magic, copies of Limerick 6, that kind of thing." Surely that must have been forbidden. Oh, certainly. He was selling some of the most precious secrets of the Aberrat, anything for profit. "Which reminds me," Candy said, "what was it with the hats? Magic doesn't always come in the form of headgear, does it?" Malingo laughed. "No, of course not. It can be in any form. A thought, a word, a fish, even in a glass of water. But you see, it was a tradition of the Nancian magic circle that you kept most of your power in your hat. I don't know how it started. Probably as a joke. But once it began, it stuck. And then when Wolfswinkle killed all the other magicians and he wanted to transfer their power to something more convenient, he couldn't. They'd all put their power in the hats when they were a circle, and once the circle was broken, he was stuck with the hats." "Exactly." How very undignified for old Banana Suit. Oh, yes, he was in a fine state when he found out. He went crazy for a week. Changing the subject. "Yes? Do you have any idea where we are?" They had entered a patch of dense shadow cast by mountainous peaks of clouds that were passing overhead. In the sea below them, an enormous shoal of fish, possessed of some exquisite luminescence, moved into view. Their brightness seemed to turn the world on its head, light spilling up from below, while darkness was cast down from the sky. "Where did you intend to take us?" Malingo asked Candy. "Back to the Yebadim Day. I know a man at the Great Head called Samuel Klepp. He could give us some advice about how to—" Before she could finish speaking, the glyph, which until now had been proceeding forward effortlessly, did a very peculiar thing. It made a sideways motion as though something was tugging on it. For a moment it zigzagged wildly, and Candy had to use all her willpower to stop it from veering off in another direction. She finally brought it back on course, but the swerve had unnerved her. "What was that?" she said. "Is the glyph deteriorating?" Malingo slapped the side of the vehicle with the flat of his hand. "I don't think so," he said. "It feels solid enough." "Then what?" "Oh no, Malingo, it's happening again." The glyph veered a second time, much more violently than it had the first, and for a moment it seemed that they were about to be pitched into the sea. Malingo slid from his seat and would have fallen had Candy not caught hold of him at the last possible moment and hauled him back to safety. The glyph, meanwhile, was gathering speed. It seemed to have elected a new destination and was simply racing toward it, all previous instructions forgotten. All Candy and Malingo could do was hang on for dear life. "Can't you slow it down?" Malingo yelled to Candy over the rushing of the wind. "I'm trying," she hollered, "but it doesn't want to listen to me. Something's got hold of us, Malingo." She glanced over at her companion, who had an expression of raw astonishment on his face. "What?" she said. "Look." His awed voice was so low she didn't hear the word. She only saw its shape replied on his lips. She saw, too, the shape of the words that followed. "The 25th hour," he said. Candy looked up. Straight ahead of the hurtling glyph was the vast column of spiraling cloud that Samuel Klepp had pointed out to her. It was indeed the 25th hour, the time out of time. "Something in there must be pulling us," Candy yelled. "But what?" said Malingo. "And why?" Candy shook her head. "I guess we're going to find out very soon," she said. There was no doubt of that. The vehicle was moving so fast that the sea and sky were virtually a blur. Candy had relinquished all mental control over the vehicle. There was no purpose in wasting energy fighting a power so much greater than her own. But as the glyph rushed toward the cloud, she couldn't help but remember the stories she'd been told about the travelers who had entered the time out of time. Most had never returned, Klepp had told her, and those who had come out of the cloud had returned crazy. Not a happy thought. "Maybe we should throw ourselves out," she yelled to Malingo over the whistling of the wind. "At this speed," he yelled back, "it would be the death of us." He was probably right. But then what would happen when they hit the wall of cloud that concealed the wonders or the terrors of the 25th hour? Wouldn't that be equally suicidal? And then, all in one sudden moment, it became too late to pitch themselves out. The glyph threw itself over and over 360 degrees, flipping so fast its passengers remained in their seats. Candy heard poor Malingo yelling in mortal terror beside her. Then all the sounds that were filling her head, Malingo's cries, the rushing of the wind, the crash of the glyph as it came to a violent halt, all of them disappeared.
This ends Disc 8. Abarat, Disc 9.
She was plunged into a sudden and absolute silence and a darkness just as sudden, just as absolute. She couldn't feel the glyph beneath her, nor, when she reached out, could she feel Malingo at her side. She seemed to be floating in blank space, her body removed from all physical contact. Then, of all things, she heard rain. It was distant, but it was reassuringly real. Whatever this lightless place was, it rained here. Seconds later, another sound came to find her. No, not one sound. Two. 2 heartbeats. Somebody was here in the darkness with her, and whoever it was, they were very close. She tried to shape a question, a simple "who's there?" but for some reason her mouth wouldn't obey the instruction. All she could do was wait and listen while the twinned hearts beat on and the downpour continued. For some reason she wasn't afraid. There was something reassuring about the mingling of heartbeats and rain. And finally there came a third sound, the last sound she expected to hear in this mysterious place. Her mother's voice. "Please don't be long, Bill," Melissa Quackenbush said. "I can't wait long." Her voice sounded remote from Candy, dulled not by distance, but by something placed between them, a wall of some kind. "Did you hear me, honey? I don't like being here on my own." Here, Candy thought. What did her mother mean by that? Was Melissa Quackenbush in the 25th hour with her? Surely not. Besides, there was something about the way her mother sounded that made Candy think that it was a younger woman who was speaking. It wasn't the tired, sad woman she had last seen making meatloaf in the kitchen in Followell Street. How long, for instance, had it been since she had heard her mother call her father honey? Years. And now, astonishment upon astonishment, she heard her father's voice replying. Like Melissa's voice, Bill Quackenbush's speech was muted, but again it was a gentler, more loving version of her father Candy was now hearing. "I promise. I'll be quick, sweetheart. You just hold on. I'll be back in just a few minutes." "Maybe I should come with you," Melissa said. "In your condition, baby," Bill Quackenbush replied lovingly. "I don't think that would be too smart. It's cold out here. You stay in the car and keep that blanket wrapped up tight around you, and I'll be back so fast you won't even know I've gone. I love you, Lambkins." "I love you too, Nachos." Lambkins? Nachos? Candy had never heard her parents exchange pet names, not even when she was very young. Perhaps she'd forgotten, but she doubted it. Lambkins and Nachos she would have remembered. She felt slightly uncomfortable, as though she was spying on a secret part of her mother and father's life, a part that belonged in some distant once upon a time when they'd both been young and happily in love. Probably before I was born, Candy murmured to herself. This time, for some reason, her mouth obeyed her instruction and the words came out. She even got an answer. "That's right," said a woman somewhere in the darkness ahead of her. It wasn't her mother who replied to her. This woman had subtle aberration inflections in her words, her tone warm and reassuring. "You haven't been born yet," she said to Candy. "I don't understand." "We just wanted to give you a hint of your past," said a second woman, her voice slightly lighter than that of the first speaker. "You need to know who you were before you became who you're going to be." "How do you know who I was?" Candy said. "Or who I'm going to be? Who are you, anyway?" "Questions, questions, questions." A third woman laughed along with the other two, and as they did so, there was a gentle blossoming of light in Candy's vicinity. By it, she saw all three women. In the middle of the trio, standing a little closer to Candy than her companions, was a woman who looked to be extraordinarily old. Her face was deeply etched with lines, and her hair, which was woven into navel-length braids, was pure white. But she still carried herself with great elegance, even in her antique phase, nor did she seem weakened by age. There was a dark energy that flickered in the delicate veins of her face and hands. The women who stood to the right and left of her were somewhat younger than the old lady, but there was nothing fixed about any of the trio. Their faces, despite the welcoming expressions they offered Candy, seemed to be full of subtle hints of transformation. The youngest of the three, her black hair cropped to her skull, carried a glimpse of something feral in an otherwise benign expression, a beast that was just out of sight behind her lovely bones. The other woman, who was black, had the strangest gaze of the three. When her long hair, which was filled with hints of bright color, parted and showed Candy her eyes, they had the glory of a night sky in them. So there they were, three protean souls, one carrying lightning, one carrying sky, one touched with wilderness. Candy felt no fear in the presence of these three, just mystification. By now, of course, she was used to experiencing that particular feeling here in the Abarat, and she'd learned what she should do in the face of mystery. She would watch and listen. The answers to her questions would probably make themselves apparent after a time. And if they didn't, then she wasn't meant to know those answers. She'd learned that, too. The women now started to identify themselves. "I'm Diamanda," said the old woman. "I'm Jofi," said the wild one. "And I'm Mespa," said the one with the night sky in her eyes. "We are the sisters of the Phantomaya," said Diamanda. "The Phantomaya?" "Shh! Keep your voice down," said Jofi, though it hadn't seemed to Candy that she'd spoken any more loudly than the other three. "By law, we shouldn't have brought you into the 25th. But one day you'll be coming here with work to do of your own. Great work. So we felt you should get a taste of it," said Mespa. "That way," said Diamanda, "when you come back, you'll be prepared. You'll know what it's like." "You sound very certain that I'm coming back," Candy said. "We are," Diamanda said. "You will have things to do here in the future. If we're reading the future right," said Mespa. "Sometimes it's hard to be sure." Now Candy thought about it. The idea didn't seem so very unlikely. If the 25th hour had let her in once, then why not again when she better understood who she was and what purpose she had in this strange world? "I want to see more of this place," Candy said, staring into the darkness that surrounded them. "Do you indeed?" said Mespa. "Yes." The three women exchanged tentative looks as though to say, "Are we ready to do this or not?" It appeared that they were, because the air suddenly quickened with life around Candy, and in it, like tiny silverfish being carried in a fast-flowing river, she saw glimpses of extraordinary things. At first, the images moved past her so fast she could make only the most rudimentary sense of them. A white tower, a field of yellow blossom, a chair sitting on the blue roof of a house, and a man in gold sitting upon it. But as her eyes grew accustomed to the way the shoal of pictures were flowing past her, she in turn became more able to snatch hold of one for a few moments, like a hot coin caught in the palm of her hand that she had time to turn over and examine on both sides before the discomfort obliged her to let it go. And there was an undeniable discomfort in seeing many of these images. They were so powerful, their shapes and their colors so full of strangeness, that it hurt her head to catch them and hold them even for a moment. It wasn't just the intensity of each image that ached, it was the fact that there were so many of them. For every coin that she caught and flipped, there were 10,000 that tumbled by, glittering and unexamined. What did she see? A woman walking upside down, fish in the sky above her, birds at her feet. A man standing in a moonlit wasteland, his head flowering like an oasis of thoughts. A city of red towers under a sky filled with falling stars. Another city made in perfect miniature and raised up on legs with a blue bird, surely vast, even monstrous to the city's inhabitants, wheeling overhead. A grotesque mask singing as it floated in midair, a creature the size of a lion with the head of a human being, vast and bearded, sitting on the lip of a volcano. A shore of some tropical island with a tiny red boat in the bay and a single star hanging over the horizon. And so on, and on, and on. The images kept flying. Sometimes there would be a sound attached to the scene, though it didn't always seem to fit, as though, just like lightning preceding thunder, the images came more quickly than the sounds, so that they were out of step with one another. Sometimes she glimpsed things that she recognized, albeit briefly. The Yebadim day rising from the misty waters of the Straits of Dusk, the Gilholly Bridge being crossed by an army of people with bright white fire springing from their heads, even Ninninghammer in the midst of a storm so violent that its young trees were being plucked from the earth and carried away. At last, just as the flow of images came close to overwhelming her, the shoal of fish began to thin out, and between the occasional flash of strangeness, the relatively reassuring vision of Diamanda, Jofi, and Mespa began to reappear. Candy was left breathless. "What?" she gasped. "What was all that?" Mespa said. "Yes." It was Diamanda who replied. "An infinitesimally small piece of a tiny fragment of a virtually invisible fraction of what is here at Autumn's Spire. The past and the present past and the future present. They're all in this place, you see. Every particular of everything in every moment of forever." "And you? The Phantomaya?" "Yes. What do you do with the images?" "We study them. We immerse ourselves in them. We protect them." "From who?" said Candy. "From any and all. These are not things a common soul needs to see." Candy laughed. "What's so funny?" said Jofi. "Well, aren't I a common soul?" said Candy. "Good question," said Diamanda. "The fact is, you are many things, my dear. Many, many things. One of them is Candy Quackenbush of the town of Merkett." "You mean Chicken Town?" "Oh, yes, of course, I mean Chicken Town. Back when I was there, it was called after my husband's grandfather." "Wait a moment," Candy said, a little smile of realization creeping into her face. "I knew I'd heard the name Diamanda before. You're Diamanda Merkett. You were married to Henry Merkett." The old woman nodded slowly, staring at Candy with fresh intensity. "I am that woman. Much changed, but in many ways the same." "Amazing," said Candy. "Is it?" Diamanda said. "I mean, am I? Why? Everything's coming full circle." "Please explain," said Diamanda. Well, my journey began with Henry Murkett, Candy said. You see, I wrote something about him. About Henry? Said Diamanda, speaking her husband's name with no lack of tenderness. You wrote about Henry? Just a few pages, Candy said. I was in the room where he committed suicide. Ah, said Diamanda softly. So that's what happened to him? Candy nodded. I'm sorry to be the one to tell you. No, don't apologize. It's better, I know, than not. I knew I'd have to make my peace with the truth sooner or later. I ran out on Henry, you see. He had so few dreams. Yes, I heard, Candy said. Not about the dreams, but about you running out on him. He thought I went to Philadelphia, but why would I do a thing like that when I knew about the Abarat? No, I caught the first ship out of that wretched world.